had planned this trip for months. The idea was simple. Leave the city behind, escape into the wilderness, and spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the forest. I had always enjoyed hiking and being outdoors, but lately, the constant noise of life and work had started to weigh me down. I wanted silence. I wanted space. I wanted a week to think, breathe, and exist without interruptions. I found a small, isolated cabin online, far from any roads, completely off the grid, accessible only by foot. The pictures made it look cozy, the kind of place where the only sounds would be wind through the trees and the occasional bird. It seemed perfect. The first day of the hike was calm. I had a heavy backpack, but I had trained for this kind of trip. My legs ached, but the ache was good, honest, normal. The trail wound through thick pines, with patches of sunlight breaking through the branches, and the air smelled of wet earth and moss. There were signs of wildlife, deer tracks in the mud, a few distant bird calls, the occasional rustle in the undergrowth, but nothing alarming. I felt competent, prepared, like I belonged there. I reached the cabin around late afternoon. It was exactly as pictured, maybe even more secluded than I expected. The windows were small and shuttered, the wooden exterior weathered but solid, the roof intact. A small porch faced a clearing that dropped into a thin valley, and beyond it, I could see the tops of more trees stretching endlessly. There was no cell signal, which I had anticipated, but a small solar panel on the roof and a wood stove inside promised comfort. I unpacked methodically, arranging my supplies and checking the firewood pile. Everything felt orderly, safe. That night, after the first fire burned low in the stove, I noticed something odd. I had been hiking in silence all day, but now the forest felt different. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees in a way that sounded almost like whispers. My eyes kept catching movement just beyond the windows, shadows that didn't match the branches or rocks outside. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, just imagination. But even as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The second day, I went for a long walk around the perimeter of the cabin. The sun was out, the air crisp and cold, and I kept expecting this eerie feeling to vanish, but it didn't. I found evidence that someone else had been near the cabin recently. Footprints in the dirt, faint but distinct. They weren't human shoes. They were heavier, almost like boots, but they were small. The thought made me uneasy. I chalked it up to other hikers, maybe hunters, and tried to push it aside. I kept moving, scanning the trees and listening to the wind. Every snap of a twig made my heart rate jump. Back at the cabin, I found the door slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it tight. The lock didn't appear broken, and nothing seemed stolen. I told myself I must have been careless, or maybe the wind had shifted it. But then I saw a mark on the wall near the stove. A small smear of something dark, a scuff like someone had brushed past it. My stomach sank. I couldn't explain it. There was no one around, and the forest was too thick to approach unnoticed. Still, I tried to convince myself that nothing had happened, that I was fine. That night was worse. The wind howled like it had never howled before, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. I kept the fire going, watching the flames and counting every noise outside. I heard branches snap in patterns that didn't make sense. The sound of footsteps crunching in the dirt came and went in irregular intervals. Every time I went to the window, I saw nothing. Darkness pressed in around the cabin, and sleep became impossible. I stayed awake all night, clutching the knife I had brought, trying to listen for any changes, trying to rationalize everything. On the third day, I decided to leave for a while, to hike back to a more familiar trail where I could get a signal and tell someone about my unease. I packed my bag, checked my supplies, and started down the trail. The first hour was fine, but then the path became uneven and overgrown. The forest seemed to close in, twisting and folding back on itself. I realized I had lost the trail markers. Panic crept in, a cold feeling that started at my chest and spread. I tried retracing my steps, but the same trees, the same undergrowth, seemed to repeat endlessly. As the hours passed, I grew desperate. My phone had no signal. My map, which I had relied on for confidence, now felt useless. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows lengthened in a way that distorted everything. I could hear sounds behind me, breaking twigs and rustling leaves that seemed just slightly too regular to be random. I ran, then slowed, then ran again, my legs screaming in protest. I stumbled over roots, scraped my hands on bark, and nearly twisted my ankle multiple times. Night fell while I was still lost. I found a small clearing and decided to build a fire, if only to keep myself visible and warm. The forest was alive with noise. The wind, the animals, the constant crunching of unseen steps. I kept the fire small, just enough to illuminate a radius around me. I sat huddled against a tree, my knife ready, my heart racing. Sleep was impossible. I thought about the cabin, the safety I had felt, and how quickly it had vanished. By the fourth day, exhaustion had set in. My muscles ached, my lips were chapped, and my fingers were raw from gripping my pack and the knife. I tried to focus on survival techniques, finding water, keeping the fire alive, rationing the remaining food. I remembered seeing a small creek near the cabin on the hike in, and I decided to try and follow it, hoping it would lead somewhere familiar. The forest resisted me. Every time I thought I was following the water, the creek seemed to vanish, leaving only mud and tangled roots. During the day, I became increasingly aware of patterns in the noises around me. Branches breaking at odd intervals, shadows moving just beyond the firelight, and footprints that appeared and disappeared in the dirt and mud. I couldn't explain it logically, and I hated that my mind was giving in to fear, but I also couldn't ignore it. The forest felt hostile now, not just indifferent. I felt trapped, watched, and hunted. On the fifth day, I had no choice but to try and sleep. My body refused to move. My legs were shaking, my head pounding. I lay near a rock outcrop, using my pack as a pillow, keeping the fire alive, and staring into the darkness. That night, I thought I heard voices, low, murmuring, but not words I could make sense of. My heart leapt into my throat. I thought I saw movement along the treeline. I gripped my knife and stayed perfectly still. Hours passed. Nothing came closer. Nothing attacked. But sleep eluded me entirely. By the sixth day, desperation had overtaken fear. I realized that wandering blindly was pointless. I decided to climb to higher ground, hoping that from a ridge or hill I could see a road, a trail, or a hint of civilization. The climb was brutal. Rocks and roots tore at my hands, and I slipped more than once. My lungs burned, my heart hammered, but I pressed on. Finally, I reached a ridge just as the sun was rising. From there, I could see a narrow dirt road winding through the trees, and in the distance, a small farmhouse. Relief flooded me in a way I had never felt before. I descended carefully, taking the trail I could make out from the ridge. It was slow going, but eventually, I emerged onto the road. I started walking along it, shouting occasionally, hoping someone would hear. Hours passed before I saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, and the driver stopped. They looked shocked, then alarmed, as they took in my state. Dirty, exhausted, clothes torn, eyes wild. I told them I had been lost in the woods for nearly a week. They called the authorities, and soon I was being taken to safety, wrapped in blankets, given food, and able to finally rest without fear. The police later went to check the area around the cabin. They found signs that someone had been living near it recently. Makeshift campsites, footprints, and food scraps, but no one was there when they arrived. They warned me that people sometimes hide in remote areas, avoiding detection for days at a time. I realized how lucky I had been. Not everyone in that situation would survive. When I finally recovered, I returned home, but the memory stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, the constant tension, the forest closing in, it never fully left. I realized that nature, while beautiful, is also indifferent, and that even in a place that looks safe, danger can exist in unexpected forms. The trip had been intended as a peaceful escape, but it had turned into a lesson in awareness, caution, and respect for the wilderness. I was grateful to be alive, and I carried that gratitude with me, a permanent reminder of how thin the line between comfort and danger can be when you are truly alone. I had always thought I was prepared for the wilderness. I had spent weekends hiking in the nearby hills, sleeping in tents, and testing my limits with long treks. But nothing could have prepared me for that cabin, that isolated stretch of forest, or the way helplessness settled into my chest like a stone. I had rented the cabin for a week, a small, weathered structure tucked deep in a national forest, far from the usual trails and other visitors. The photos online made it seem rustic but charming. A single story with a sloped roof, a stone fireplace, and a narrow porch. I imagined evenings spent reading by firelight, mornings waking to birdsong, and entire days hiking and exploring. What I hadn't imagined was the solitude, the way it wrapped around me until it became suffocating, and the creeping sense that I was no longer in control of my own safety. The drive to the cabin had been long, a winding route over dirt and gravel roads that barely qualified as roads. My car struggled through the mud patches from the recent rain. I remember feeling exhilarated as I finally turned off the last stretch of road onto a narrow path flanked by towering pines. The trees were so close together that in some places the sunlight barely reached the ground. It was beautiful, and I remember thinking how perfect this place would be for a quiet week away from the world. My optimism, however, was naive. That beauty, I would learn, had a sharp edge, and the forest didn't forgive mistakes. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the dense trees, casting long, trembling shadows across the path. The cabin sat on a small clearing, its weathered wood gray and rough, the porch sagging slightly on one side. I parked my car beside it, grabbed my bag, and stepped onto the porch. The air was thick and still, scented with damp earth and pine resin. I remember noticing a few stray branches had fallen across the small walkway leading to the front door. The smell of wet wood and moss clung to everything. I paused for a moment, taking it in, trying to shake a faint unease that had settled over me. That unease, in hindsight, was the first sign that something was off. The cabin itself was small but functional. Inside, a single room served as living and kitchen space, with a narrow loft for sleeping. The furniture was sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a wooden bench, and a few shelves that held dusty pots, pans, and canned goods. A stone fireplace dominated one corner. I set my bag down and began unpacking, telling myself I had arrived early enough to get settled before nightfall. The first few hours passed uneventfully, with the familiar tasks of unpacking, lighting a fire, and preparing a simple meal. The forest outside darkened quickly, and by the time I had finished, the world outside the cabin was a solid black mass punctuated only by faint glimmers of starlight through the trees. It was after the fire had died down to glowing embers that I first heard it. A soft, deliberate snap, like a branch breaking under weight. I froze, listening. The sound came from outside the cabin, somewhere along the edge of the clearing. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. The forest was alive with animals, after all. Still, the sound repeated, slower this time, with a rhythm that didn't quite feel random. I tried to ignore it, busying myself with tidying the cabin and preparing for bed. By the time I climbed into the loft, I convinced myself the noises had been in my imagination, my mind playing tricks in the dark. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound, the creaking of the wooden beams, the scratching of something against the cabin walls, the wind stirring the trees, made me tense. Around midnight, a louder, heavier sound echoed across the clearing, the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. I bolted upright, staring into the dark, my ears straining. Whoever or whatever was outside was moving closer. I wanted to tell myself it was a park ranger or another hiker, but the thought didn't comfort me. The nearest road was miles away, and I was certain I was alone in the forest. I grabbed the small flashlight I had placed on the floor and pointed it toward the window. Nothing, only darkness. The sound stopped, leaving a heavy silence that pressed against my chest. I didn't sleep again that night. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my pulse spike. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the loft, flashlight in hand, listening to the forest and imagining every worst-case scenario. The following day, I forced myself to stick to my plan. Breakfast, hiking, exploring. I tried to convince myself the previous night had been paranoia. The sun was bright, the air crisp, and the forest was tranquil. My confidence began to return. I hiked a few miles, noting the familiar markers on trees, examining the trail for changes or hazards. The forest was deceptive. It was beautiful but labyrinthine. Even minor deviations in the path could lead to hours of wandering. I had studied the trail map meticulously, and yet when I tried to retrace my steps back to the cabin, I realized I had underestimated how isolated this area truly was. The trail forked in ways I hadn't anticipated, and landmarks that seemed familiar from the morning looked entirely different in the changing light. I felt a faint panic rising. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. This was when I realized just how vulnerable I was. Alone, without communication, and miles from the nearest road, I was entirely at the mercy of my surroundings. It took hours of careful navigation, using the sun and the map, to find my way back. By the time I saw the cabin again, the sun was low, and shadows stretched across the clearing. I approached slowly, scanning the edges of the trees. The door was closed, just as I had left it, but there were marks on the porch, footprints, muddied and partially obscured by fallen leaves. I froze. I had been certain no one else was in the area. My mind raced. Were these new? How long had they been here? My instincts screamed at me to leave, to drive back immediately. But the car was still stuck in the mud along the narrow path, and I had no way to reach help. I decided to go inside and secure the cabin as best as I could. I locked the door, jammed a chair against it, and set up the flashlight on the table, keeping it within reach. Every sound outside made me flinch. The wind, the trees, the snapping branches. It was all too easy to imagine someone moving closer, waiting, watching. The night stretched endlessly. The rustling returned, now accompanied by heavier, deliberate sounds. Footsteps on the gravel, dragging noises, occasional thumps that sounded like something large being moved. I had the flashlight and a small hatchet, but it felt useless against the unknown presence. Hours passed in tense silence, interrupted by occasional bursts of sound. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the edge of the clearing. My heart raced and I gripped the hatchet tighter. I remember thinking I had never felt so exposed, so fragile, as I did in those hours. The forest that had seemed beautiful and peaceful now felt alive in a menacing way, each sound amplified, each shadow a potential threat. By the second day, exhaustion had begun to set in. I barely slept, and the constant vigilance was draining me physically and mentally. I rationed food carefully, drinking water from the small supply I had brought. The forest remained unnervingly quiet during the day, as if whatever had been outside was only active at night. I decided I needed a plan. I couldn't remain trapped in the cabin indefinitely. I resolved to walk back to the main road, carefully during daylight, hoping the visibility would offer some measure of safety. I packed a small bag with water, food, the hatchet, and my flashlight, intending to leave at first light. That morning, the forest seemed deceptively calm. I checked the surroundings carefully, noting the tracks around the cabin. They were still there, deeper now from the overnight rain. Someone or something had clearly been moving around. I moved cautiously, keeping the backpack tight against my body, scanning the treeline as I followed what I thought was the safest path. Hours of walking passed. My legs were sore, my backpack heavy, but I kept going, driven by a need to escape the oppressive fear that had gripped me since the first night. I tried to stick to open paths, avoiding dense underbrush where someone could hide. Every few minutes, I would stop, listening, straining to detect any sign of pursuit. Around mid-afternoon, the forest began to thin, the trees spreading farther apart. I saw the glint of a distant road through the branches. Relief surged, but I remained cautious, knowing that until I reached the open road, nothing was guaranteed. As I approached the clearing where the road appeared, I spotted a small vehicle parked off to the side. A man was sitting inside, watching the forest. My pulse spiked again, but this time in cautious hope. I called out, waving my arms. He saw me, got out, and motioned for me to come forward. I approached slowly, my relief tempered by lingering fear. He was a local, familiar with the forest. He listened as I explained briefly without embellishing the isolation, the strange sounds, the footprints, my fear. He nodded, offering practical help. I followed him to the vehicle. The sight of the road, the car, the promise of communication and safety was overwhelming. I felt like I could finally breathe again. Back in town, after a hot shower, a proper meal, and speaking with authorities about the cabin, I learned something that made my skin crawl. The area had been targeted recently by a group of squatters who moved stealthily through the forest, looking for cabins to occupy, stealing supplies, and sometimes confronting anyone who discovered them. They had likely been near or inside the cabin when I arrived, explaining the footprints, the sounds, and the sense of being watched. The authorities had tracked them to another abandoned property nearby, but the thought of how close I had come to being caught, possibly harmed, stayed with me. I realized then that the wilderness was not only about nature but also about people, and isolation could be just as dangerous as any natural hazard. The experience left me shaken but also determined. I no longer romanticized isolation in the wilderness. I understood the importance of preparation, caution, and humility. I returned home, forever changed by those nights in the cabin. I couldn't unsee the fear, the feeling of being trapped, the awareness of my own vulnerability. But I had survived. I had navigated my way back to safety, relying on observation, patience, and careful decision-making. In the end, the cabin, the forest, and the sounds that haunted me had not destroyed me. They had tested me, stretched me to my limits, and reminded me that the line between adventure and danger was thinner than I had ever imagined. I would never take solitude for granted again, nor the simple reassurance of knowing that other people, other safety, were never too far away. The forest remained beautiful, but I had learned to respect it in a way I never had before. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of a remote cabin in the mountains, far from the noise of the city, was something I thought would bring me peace. I had chosen a cabin I found listed online, tucked into a dense forest several miles from the nearest road. The photos made it look isolated but cozy, a small wooden structure with a porch overlooking a clearing. I packed my car with everything I thought I might need: extra blankets, a sleeping bag, canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a small gas stove. I told myself I was prepared for anything. I wasn't. The drive had taken longer than expected. The paved road ended abruptly at a rough dirt trail that led into the forest. Every mile deeper into the woods made the air smell cleaner, but the shadows under the trees grew longer and darker. The sun was already low when I finally pulled up to the cabin. It was exactly as the pictures had shown. Small, weathered, and silent, with the forest pressing close on all sides. I parked my car and took a long breath, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the usual quiet of the city, which was never really quiet, but a deep, heavy silence. The kind where even my footsteps on the porch sounded loud. I unloaded my things and carried them inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and mildew. Dust coated the floorboards, and spiderwebs hung in the corners. I shrugged off the dirt, thinking that was part of the charm. I spent the first hour unpacking and organizing. I lit the small wood stove in the corner, and the room slowly warmed. Outside, the forest was already deep in shadow. I had brought a stack of firewood from the shed near the porch and piled it next to the stove. The sunlight had disappeared completely, leaving only a dim glow through the thin curtains. I ate a quick meal, feeling a strange thrill at being alone so far from civilization. Night came fast. The cabin, I realized, had no electricity, and the only light came from the fire and a few small battery-powered lanterns I had brought. The wind picked up, rustling the trees outside. I sat on the porch for a while, staring into the darkness, feeling both peaceful and oddly vulnerable. The forest seemed alive with sounds: cracking branches, distant rustling, the occasional call of an animal. I told myself it was nothing, just the normal wildlife, but I couldn't shake a small knot of tension in my stomach. The first night was restless. Every noise made me tense. I kept imagining someone or something moving outside. I would turn on my flashlight, scan the clearing, and see nothing but shadows. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep with the fire dying low. The next morning, I woke to heavy rain. The sky was gray, and the forest looked wet and unwelcoming. I had brought supplies for several days, so I didn't worry, but the sound of the rain hitting the roof was relentless, a constant drumming that seemed to press against my mind. I decided to stay inside, lighting the stove and drinking coffee while listening to the storm. By the second day, I noticed something strange. The firewood I had stacked neatly was slightly disturbed. Not much, just a piece shifted one log closer to the stove than I remembered. I assumed the wind had moved it, or perhaps an animal had brushed against the porch. I checked the windows and doors. Everything seemed secure. I tried to ignore it, but a tiny thread of unease had begun to grow. That night, the storm worsened. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain lashed against the roof. I could hear branches breaking and falling outside. The cabin shuddered with every gust, and the shadows cast by the fire flickered wildly on the walls. Sleep was impossible. I sat in a corner, listening, my flashlight on, scanning the windows, my heart pounding with every creak and groan of the cabin. Around midnight, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside on the porch. My stomach dropped. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. I froze, straining to listen. The rain masked most of the sound, but I could hear the faint crunch of wet leaves. My mind raced. Who could be out there? There were no neighbors for miles, and the road was nearly impassable in the storm. My first instinct was to call for help, but my phone had no signal. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and moved cautiously to the door. My hand shook as I unlatched it and pushed the door open a crack. The porch was empty. My relief was immediate but short-lived. Wet footprints led from the edge of the porch into the woods. I followed them with my flashlight. They were too large to be a small animal and too deep to have been made by something that had just passed. The rain had softened the ground, but the prints were clear. Someone had been here. Panic rose in my chest. I went back inside, locked every door and window, and piled furniture against the door. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it might have been someone lost in the storm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the rest of the night in the corner near the stove, knife in hand, listening to the storm. Every gust of wind, every branch snapping outside, made my heart jump. I barely slept. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the forest wet and heavy with fog. I cautiously opened the door. The footprints were gone. I checked the perimeter. There was no sign of anyone, no vehicle tracks, nothing except the damp forest. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I needed to understand where I was and what dangers might be around. The forest was dense, and every step I took seemed to echo unnaturally. I found no other signs of human presence. The only sound was the occasional drip of water from the trees. I tried to relax, telling myself that my imagination had been running wild during the storm. By the evening, I was exhausted from walking and decided to stay inside. I built a strong fire, eating a simple meal and trying to feel secure. But as the sun dipped below the trees, I realized I had no idea how I would survive if someone really had been stalking me. The isolation that had seemed so appealing now felt suffocating. The second night brought more sounds, footsteps, low rustling, the occasional thump against the cabin walls. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, heart hammering. Then I heard something different, a faint scratching at the back door. I held my breath. Whoever it was had learned I was inside. I thought of leaving, but the rain had turned the dirt road into mud. My car would be useless, and I couldn't risk being seen running through the forest. Hours passed. I sat in the darkness, listening. The scratching stopped at dawn. Exhausted and trembling, I resolved to wait for daylight to make my move. When the sun finally rose, I cautiously stepped outside. I scanned the clearing, the forest edge, and the porch. Everything seemed normal. I decided to pack my things and leave immediately. As I loaded my car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A tree branch, freshly cut, leaning against the side of the cabin. Someone had been close enough to leave it there overnight. I realized I had been under surveillance and possibly trapped for 2 days. I drove down the muddy trail as fast as I dared, eyes scanning the trees constantly. Every shadow looked like movement, every bend in the trail a possible ambush. Hours later, I finally reached the paved road and, eventually, a small town. I stopped at a gas station, shaking, exhausted, and realized how close I had come to a disaster. I never went back to the cabin. I reported the location to local authorities, explaining the footprints and the signs that someone had been stalking me. They said the area was remote and that hikers or hunters occasionally came across abandoned cabins. No one had reported a crime, but they warned me to stay away from that forest. The memory of that cabin stayed with me for years. I had gone there expecting solitude and peace, but instead, I faced fear I had never imagined. The silence, the isolation, the subtle signs that someone had been near. I could still feel it, even now. It changed the way I thought about the wilderness. The forest was no longer a place of quiet beauty for me. It was unpredictable, alive, and full of dangers that no one could see until it was too late. I learned a lot from that trip. How quickly fear could take hold, how important it was to respect isolation, and how unprepared I had been for the reality of being completely alone in a remote place. I learned to always check the surroundings, to trust instincts, and to plan for the worst no matter how peaceful the location seemed. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the most terrifying experiences are not the ones you imagine, but the ones that actually happen. That cabin, abandoned as it seemed, was never just a simple place to stay. It was a lesson in vigilance and respect for the world outside human control. And I carry that lesson with me every time I find myself drawn to the quiet, to the wilderness, and to the promise of solitude. Because solitude is never free, comes at a cost, and sometimes the cost is fear. I had been planning this trip for months, saving up every spare penny, and finally the weekend came when I could escape the city. I found the cabin through a small online listing. Remote, deep in the woods of northern Maine, isolated but accessible, with a small lake nearby. Pictures showed a rough-hewn wooden cabin, smoke curling from a stone chimney, and the surrounding forest dense and green. It looked perfect for a weekend of solitude, fresh air, and clearing my mind. I didn't realize how much perfect could turn into something dangerous until I was already driving down the winding, nearly invisible dirt road leading to it. The drive was long. My car rattled over potholes, and the road narrowed to a barely there track under overhanging branches. Every few miles, I passed a small clearing, a pile of old machinery rusting beside the road, maybe remnants of logging activity. I didn't see another car, house, or human being the entire way. My phone had already lost signal an hour into the drive, and I figured that was part of the point. Total disconnection. When I finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, the shadows of the pine trees stretching across the ground. The cabin looked just like the photos. The wood smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and the air had that crisp, cold edge you only find in deep forests. I carried my bags inside, noting the modest furnishings. A small kitchen area, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed that looked serviceable but uncomfortable. I had brought a small stack of firewood, enough for the weekend, though there was also a pile outside covered by a tarp. I spent the first hour unpacking and exploring the small clearing around the cabin. The lake was a 5-minute walk down a slope of thick underbrush, and the water reflected the sky as the light faded. The forest all around was dense. It felt like I could step 10 feet in any direction and be swallowed by trees. I liked that feeling at first, the sense of isolation. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a bird. As darkness fell, I started the fire in the wood stove. The light from the flames threw dancing shadows across the walls, and the heat was welcome after the chill of the late afternoon. I had brought some simple food: canned beans, a small bag of rice, and a few granola bars. I cooked a modest dinner, listening to the crackle of the fire, and tried to relax. That night, I slept uneasily. The forest made strange noises, branches snapping under invisible weight, animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional high-pitched squeal I couldn't identify. My dreams were fragmented, full of running through dark trees, feeling the forest pressing in on me, but I woke each time reassured that it was just imagination. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike. I didn't have a map, relying on the small trail that left the clearing behind the cabin. The trail was rough, uneven, and overgrown in places. It followed a small creek for a while before climbing into higher, rockier ground. I had brought a small day pack: water, snacks, a flashlight, a knife, and a compass. The compass might have been unnecessary, but something about carrying it made me feel safer. As the day went on, I realized the forest was much more confusing than I had thought. Every ridge looked the same, every cluster of trees similar. I paused several times to check my compass, but without a proper map, it was difficult to track my direction. I tried to mark my path with small piles of stones, but the terrain was uneven, and some were knocked over by wind or animals. By late afternoon, the sun was lower, and I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to have shifted. Trails I thought I had passed didn't look familiar. Panic started to creep in. I knew it was possible to get lost in the woods, but I had assumed the cabin was close enough to any trail I took. Now, I wasn't sure which way was back. I decided to head downhill, reasoning that the cabin was near the lake and the terrain sloped downward. The ground was uneven, full of roots and loose rocks. I slipped several times, catching myself just in time. By the time I reached a flatter area, shadows were stretching across the forest floor. My heart rate picked up, my mouth dry. I had been confident in my skills, but suddenly everything felt threatening. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, a snap of a branch, made me start. I found a small clearing, a bit bigger than the others I had seen, and decided I had to stay put for a while. My water was low, my energy fading. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I had a flashlight, some food, and my knife. Night was coming faster than I expected. As darkness fell, the forest became more menacing. I kept thinking I heard footsteps, or maybe it was an animal. My mind played tricks on me, every branch snapping like someone walking nearby. I found a flat area of soil and laid down a tarp I had brought, trying to make a small camp. I started a small fire with kindling I carried, but it barely provided light or heat. The fire's crackle sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. I stayed awake for most of the night, my eyes darting to shadows, my ears straining for any sound that might indicate danger. Morning brought no relief. The forest was still endless, the paths confusing. I spent hours trying to retrace my steps. I kept thinking of the cabin, the comfort of four walls, the warmth of the stove. My legs were sore, and the ache of hunger made concentration difficult. I realized I had made mistakes. I hadn't marked the trail properly. I had wandered farther than I should, and now I didn't know where I was. By midday, I decided to follow a small stream, hoping it led to the lake near the cabin. The stream was slow-moving and shallow, but it gave me direction. As I walked, I stumbled on roots and rocks, falling twice and scraping my hands and knees. The sun passed overhead, and the forest grew warmer, making my exhaustion worse. My throat was dry, and I rationed water carefully, drinking only when necessary. As evening approached, I started to feel desperate. The forest seemed infinite, shadows stretching like they had the day before, but darker now. I considered trying to climb a hill to see if I could spot the cabin, but every ridge I reached seemed to reveal nothing but more trees. I kept the stream in sight, moving slowly, hoping it would eventually meet the lake. My stomach ached, my head throbbed, and my body was covered in scratches from branches and rocks. Then, just as I was about to give up hope, I heard something faint. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it repeated. A distant but recognizable sound of water lapping against a shore. My pulse quickened. I pushed myself harder, moving faster despite the fatigue. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled onto a small beach. The lake was there, just as I had hoped. I could see the cabin across the clearing, smoke faintly rising from the chimney. Relief washed over me in a way I had never felt before. I ran the last few 100 meters, my body protesting every step. When I reached the cabin, I was shaking, covered in dirt and scratches, but safe. I lit a fire in the stove, ate some canned food, and drank water like I had never done before. Sitting by the fire, I reflected on the experience. The forest was beautiful, peaceful when I was calm, but it was also unforgiving and disorienting. A few mistakes, a lack of preparation, and I could have been in serious trouble. The rest of the weekend, I stayed close to the cabin. I explored the area, marking my paths carefully, never venturing far. I realized how lucky I had been to follow the stream and find the lake. Each sound of the forest made me alert, but I learned to move with care, watching every step, keeping track of my surroundings. When I finally left, I took every precaution to make sure I could return safely. I studied maps, marked trails with ribbons, and made mental notes of landmarks. That trip changed how I thought about isolation and the wilderness. I had gone seeking solitude, beauty, and escape, but I had found vulnerability, fear, and the raw power of nature. I understood that even a familiar path could become confusing, and that survival often depended not on skill alone, but on careful observation, preparation, and a clear mind. Returning home, I unpacked my gear, cleaned my scratches, and wrote detailed notes about the trails, landmarks, and mistakes I had made. I kept a small emergency kit ready at all times. The experience had been terrifying, exhausting, and humbling, but it had also taught me resilience, patience, and respect for the forest. The cabin that once seemed a simple weekend retreat had shown me the consequences of being unprepared and the relief of making it through a real challenge with clear thinking and determination. I never forgot the panic of the second night, lying on the tarp, listening to the forest breathe and move around me, or the sense of triumph when I finally saw the cabin across the lake. That memory stayed with me, vivid, a reminder that danger can come silently, and that awareness and calm can be the difference between being lost forever and returning safely. I had been driving for hours, the tires of my old SUV crunching over gravel and dirt roads that wound through the forest like veins. The GPS had lost signal long ago, but the cabin was supposed to be nearby, and I trusted the map I had printed from the rental site. I had chosen this place because I wanted to disconnect, to leave the world behind for a few days. But now, as the sun dipped behind the dense line of pines, I began to question the wisdom of my decision. The road narrowed, the trees pressing in from both sides, their shadows stretching long and dark across the windshield. Finally, I saw it. The cabin was small, weathered, and wooden, with faded paint peeling from the walls and a tin roof that had rusted in patches. Smoke curled from the chimney, though the wind carried no smell of fire, making me wonder if it had been abandoned for months. I parked the SUV on the uneven patch of dirt in front and stepped out. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and damp earth. I could hear nothing but the wind moving through the branches and the distant drip of water somewhere in the trees. The cabin door was unlocked, which surprised me. Inside, it smelled of dust, damp wood, and the faint, sour scent of old food. The interior was small and Spartan. There was a kitchen with a cracked countertop, a small living area with a threadbare couch, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The single bedroom was little more than a narrow bed with a worn blanket. I unpacked my bag, set down my flashlight, and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. It was just a cabin in the woods, nothing more. By nightfall, the forest outside seemed to grow heavier. Shadows pressed against the windows, and the wind made the branches scratch against the walls like fingernails. I lit a small lamp and ate a simple dinner, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. It wasn't a presence I could see. It was the sense of being watched, of subtle movements beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, the product of isolation and fatigue, but my stomach nodded anyway. I decided to check the perimeter. The moon was bright, silver white, and it lit the trees in a way that made every shadow look deeper. The forest seemed to breathe around me. I walked slowly, the dirt crunching under my boots, circling the cabin. Nothing moved. No animals, no signs of life beyond the faint rustle of leaves. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been following the cabin for a long time. The first night passed without incident, though I woke repeatedly, listening to the creaks of the cabin and the occasional snap of a branch. In the morning, I explored the nearby creek, which sparkled in the sun and seemed harmless, almost serene. I told myself I was being paranoid. This was the woods. Animals moved around. The wind made noises. Things settled differently. Still, I kept the doors locked. The second night, the feeling intensified. I was in the kitchen when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the back door creaking, slowly, as though someone had turned the knob. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, straining to hear beyond the low hum of the lamp. Another creak, a shuffle, and then silence. I checked the door. Locked. I checked the windows. Locked. Nothing was out of place, yet I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been inside, or at least tried. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, flashlight in hand, staring into the blackness beyond. Every rustle, every snapping twig, made my stomach churn. I imagined someone moving through the trees, crouching low, just out of sight, watching me. I thought about leaving, driving back to the main road, but the dirt paths were tricky, and it was late. I stayed, telling myself that maybe it had just been a loose hinge. But deep down, I knew it hadn't. The next day, I made careful rounds of the cabin, checking every door and window. I found scratches on the back door frame, thin, fresh, as though someone had tried to force it open. I traced my fingers along the marks, my stomach twisting. I wasn't alone. Someone had been here, watching, waiting. I felt a cold anger mix with fear, a primal need to survive, to be careful. I didn't go far that day. I stayed inside, barricading the back door with a chair and pushing the sofa against it. I moved furniture to block potential entry points and kept the flashlight close. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows, and with every creak and groan of the old wood, I imagined footsteps on the porch. Hours stretched like days. I was exhausted but couldn't sleep, listening to every sound, every whisper of the forest. By the third night, the intrusions had become unmistakable. Footsteps on the porch, soft but deliberate. The back door handle rattling, and once, the faintest sound of breathing outside the window. I kept myself in the far corner of the room, near the only window that looked out over the creek. My plan was simple: survive until morning. But I knew I couldn't call for help. No signal, no neighbors, just the forest and whoever had decided to make the cabin their hunting ground. At some point, the intruder or intruders made a mistake. I was lying on the floor, my back pressed against the wall, when I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. The chair I had used to barricade the door had toppled over. I held my breath, counting seconds, praying. Then silence. I slowly crawled toward the kitchen. Nothing. The door was closed. No one inside. No sign of forced entry beyond the fallen chair. My heart was racing. Whoever it was had retreated. I spent the next hours fortifying the cabin, pushing tables and chairs against the windows, locking the doors, and searching the perimeter for anything out of place. I found footprints, several sets, leading into the trees and disappearing near the creek. I didn't follow, couldn't. I only documented them, traced them, trying to understand the pattern. Whoever it was, they weren't random. They were familiar with the cabin, with the land, moving with caution, watching, waiting. By the fourth day, I realized I had to leave. I couldn't survive another night without encountering whoever had been stalking me. I packed quietly, checked the SUV, and waited until twilight to make my move. The forest was deceptive in its beauty at that hour, soft light filtering through the branches, masking the sharp shadows that could hide a person crouched low. I drove slowly, scanning the trees, every noise making me jump, At one point, I saw movement, barely a flash, but it was enough. My hands clenched the wheel, knuckles white, as I pushed forward. The dirt roads were tricky, narrow, and full of ruts. My tires skidded more than once. I forced myself to focus, following the faint glow of the last light over the horizon. At one point, I caught sight of a figure standing between the trees, motionless, watching me. I slammed the accelerator, tires spinning in the loose gravel. The figure didn't move as I passed, just faded into the darkness behind me. When I finally reached the paved road, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I drove without stopping for miles, until I reached the first gas station, where I finally let myself breathe. The relief was overwhelming, a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and adrenaline. I reported the incident, describing the cabin and the footprints, but the area was remote. Local authorities promised to check, but I knew there was little they could do without evidence. Looking back, I realized the isolation had worked both for and against me. The cabin, the forest, the quiet. All of it made the fear unbearable because I was completely exposed. Yet that same isolation had forced me to be cautious, aware, and deliberate. I had survived because I never let myself forget that I was alone, and someone else had been close, maybe even inside the cabin, watching, waiting. I never returned to that forest, and I never rented a cabin in the woods again. I still dream about the sound of the back door creaking, the faint footprints in the dirt, the shadowy figure standing silently between the trees. But I also remember the details that kept me alive. The locks, the barricades, the careful observation of every sound and movement. In the end, I survived because I treated the fear as reality, not imagination. And that night, when I finally drove into safety, I knew with absolute clarity that I had escaped something that could have ended me. Even now, years later, the memory of that cabin, the cold, the silence, the presence I could not see, remains with me. I keep photos of the footprints, notes about the layout, and even the chair I used to barricade the door. It is a reminder not just of fear, but of survival. I survived because I respected the danger, stayed vigilant, and never underestimated what could happen when isolation meets human malice. And for that, I remain grateful. It started as a trip I thought would be peaceful. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a week, hoping to get away from the noise of the city and the endless obligations at work. I was tired, worn out, and I wanted nothing more than to sit in silence, read, write, and just breathe. The cabin was listed online as secluded but accessible, with electricity, running water, and a small wood stove for heat. The pictures made it look quaint, surrounded by tall pines and a creek that ran nearby. The map said it was a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. That was enough to make me feel distant and safe. I didn't consider the other side of seclusion, the absolute isolation, where no one would notice if something went wrong. The drive there was long, winding, and tiring. The further I went, the narrower the roads became, eventually turning into gravel and dirt trails that twisted between trees so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. I noticed the signs of abandonment almost immediately. Old, rusted farm equipment, crumbling fences, patches of land overgrown with weeds. The air grew heavy and still, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine needles. When I finally arrived at the cabin, my relief was immediate. It was small, perhaps 30 feet long, with a sloped roof and a stone chimney. The exterior wood was weathered and gray, but structurally solid. I parked my car in a small clearing and walked up the steps, taking in the quiet. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen on one side, a wood stove in the center, a couch with a thick blanket draped over it, and a loft bedroom above. The windows were dusty, but the view of the forest was untouched. I unpacked my things slowly, savoring the silence. For the first day, nothing happened except the occasional snap of branches outside. I set up the stove, made myself some food, and walked down to the creek. The water was cold and clear, trickling over stones and fallen logs. I felt completely alone but oddly content, the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The second day, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. I didn't have a specific plan, just wanted to walk. The forest was dense, and I quickly realized I was farther from the cabin than I had expected. I could still see it in the distance if I looked closely, but every path looked the same. Tall pine trunks, scattered leaves, fallen branches, and the occasional pile of rocks that might have been used as markers. I was careful to keep track of where I was, marking trees with chalk and broken twigs. I didn't bring a map, thinking I'd remember the way, but I quickly realized that without landmarks, the forest erased any sense of direction. I noticed signs of wildlife, broken branches, claw marks on tree trunks, rustling in the bushes, but nothing directly threatening. Still, I kept my phone close. The reception was spotty at best, but I could usually get a signal at the clearing near the cabin. By mid-afternoon, I returned, sweaty, scratched from brambles, but satisfied. The woods were beautiful, but I felt a nagging unease that I couldn't place. I told myself it was just being alone in a new place. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard sounds I hadn't noticed before. At first, it was subtle. A branch snapping here, the faint scurrying of something small over the floorboards. Then it became more distinct. Footsteps, outside, around the cabin. They weren't animalistic. They were heavy, deliberate, slow, walking along the perimeter. I froze, listening, my heart hammering. I told myself it was the wind or a deer, but the pattern didn't match any animal I knew. The steps paused and then resumed, circling the cabin. I held my breath until they stopped. I didn't sleep much that night, listening to the forest settle and convincing myself it was nothing. The next day, I went for a longer hike, trying to distract myself. I brought more supplies, a larger backpack, water, food, a first aid kit, and a small axe I kept for safety. I told myself it was precaution. Hours passed as I walked deeper into the woods. I discovered an abandoned hunting shack, barely standing, with a collapsed roof and bullet holes in the walls. The place smelled of decay, mold, and old smoke. I didn't stay long, just peered inside and then left. On my way back, I noticed signs I hadn't before. Footprints in soft mud, large and irregular, too big to be mine. They seemed fresh, as though someone had been walking in the woods during the night. I tried not to panic, reminding myself the nearest road was miles away and that the woods could easily carry impressions from animals or other hikers. But the unease grew, a tight knot in my stomach I couldn't ignore. That night, I heard the footsteps again, but closer this time. They weren't around the perimeter. They were moving straight toward the cabin. I stayed frozen, listening. The sound of gravel shifting under boots made me feel exposed. I considered leaving, but my car was parked in the clearing, maybe half a mile away, and the darkness was thick. I stayed inside, windows locked, lights off, crouched near the stove with the axe in hand. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing, and I could hear breathing. Not my own, not any sound from animals. I held my breath, thinking maybe they'd leave. Eventually, they did, retreating into the woods, but my fear didn't dissipate. I sat up the entire night, sweating, gripping the axe, listening to every crack and rustle outside. By the third day, I realized I had to do something. The isolation was terrifying, but the thought of encountering someone dangerous, in this empty wilderness was worse. I started planning a route back to civilization in case things escalated. I marked a path through the forest, noting landmarks, and packed a small bag with essentials: water, food, flashlight, knife, and my phone. I didn't want to leave the cabin unless absolutely necessary, but I had to be prepared. The following day, I saw signs that someone had been closer to the cabin than I imagined. There were footprints around the porch, dirt tracked inside the entrance, and small items moved. A rock that had been on the steps, a stick by the door. My heart sank. I knew then that I wasn't alone in the woods. Someone had been watching me, maybe for hours. My fear turned into determination. I decided I would leave as soon as possible, but I would be careful, making no noise, keeping a low profile. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, listening, preparing to act if the person returned. The next morning, I packed everything in silence. I didn't leave any signs of movement inside, just quietly gathering supplies and closing the door behind me. I chose a path through the woods that was less traveled, away from the tracks I had seen. I moved cautiously, keeping my senses sharp, listening for any indication that someone was following me. The forest that had seemed peaceful before now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap me. Every snapped branch or rustle of leaves made me freeze. I realized I had underestimated how vulnerable I was. Hours passed, and I kept moving, careful to avoid obvious trails that might have led back to the cabin. By late afternoon, I finally reached a logging road I hadn't noticed before, which led to a main road and eventually to civilization. I didn't stop until I saw cars and houses, until I felt the relief of safety wash over me. I called the local authorities and reported the situation, though I didn't expect them to do much. The area was known for transient people, hikers, and occasional hunters. Looking back, I realized how naive I had been. The cabin was perfect in pictures, the forest beautiful in sunlight, but isolation is dangerous in ways that aren't romantic. The fear I felt, the constant, unrelenting knowledge that someone could be near without me knowing, was more intense than any horror story I had read. It left a mark on me, a memory that replayed every time I thought of the woods. Months later, I returned to the area cautiously, with friends this time, to retrieve some of my things. The footprints were gone, the dirt washed by rain, and the forest looked unchanged. But I stayed alert, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. I realized that even when the danger seems gone, the memory of it lingers. I sold the cabin rental rights afterward. I couldn't risk it again, not for the promise of solitude, not for the illusion of peace. In the end, I learned a hard truth. Isolation magnifies vulnerability. Nature itself is not frightening, but people, other humans, can turn it into a trap. The fear of being watched, of someone moving silently in the forest while you are alone, is more powerful than any supernatural story. And for me, that experience became a permanent lesson. Safety is not just about distance from others. It's about preparation, awareness, and the understanding that sometimes the wilderness is only as peaceful as the people who share it with you. I never went back to that cabin alone. I never forgot the quiet footsteps, the shadowy figures just beyond the clearing, or the hours I spent crouched near a stove, gripping an axe, waiting for something to happen. But I also walked away alive, and eventually, the fear became a memory, sharpened and clear, a reminder that survival depends not on luck, but on vigilance, calm, and understanding your environment completely. I had been planning this trip for months, counting down the days with a quiet anticipation that was hard to explain. Life in the city had been suffocating me slowly, in ways I hadn't realized until I couldn't ignore them anymore. Every day was the same. Crowded streets, loud traffic, constant noise, and people rushing everywhere without reason. My apartment was small, and even there, the walls seemed to close in on me as the hours passed. I needed silence. I needed to breathe. The idea of staying alone in a cabin deep in the woods, far from everything, sounded like salvation. The cabin wasn't far from the nearest town, but it was isolated enough that I knew I would see no one unless I wanted to. The owner, an old man I met once when renting the place, assured me it was private, secure, and completely off the radar. "No one comes here," he had said. Though his eyes had a flicker of uncertainty I chose to ignore. I convinced myself it was just an old man's habit of exaggeration. I had all my supplies packed: food for a week, water, fuel for the stove, a few books, and a first aid kit. I had left my phone at home intentionally. No calls, no notifications, no interruptions. Just me and the woods. The drive there was long but uneventful. The road narrowed the further I went, twisting around hills and dense trees, until it became little more than a dirt track. The air changed noticeably once I left the highway behind. Cleaner, cooler, scented faintly with pine and damp earth. When I finally turned a bend and the cabin came into view, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The building was small, made of weathered wood, and sat on a slight rise overlooking a creek that glimmered in the afternoon sun. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though I doubted anyone was home. Probably just the remnants of the last tenant's fire. The first night was uneventful, peaceful even. I set the fire in the stove, made a simple meal, and then sat by the window looking out at the forest. The sky darkened slowly, stars appearing one by one, and I felt something settle in me that I hadn't felt in years. Real calm. There were sounds, of course. The wind through the trees, the rustle of leaves, and distant calls of birds settling down for the night. I didn't think much of them. This was normal. This was exactly what I had wanted. The second day was spent exploring the area. The woods were dense, filled with fallen logs, moss-covered rocks, and tangled roots that made every step an exercise in balance. I walked down to the creek, noticing small fish darting beneath the surface and the occasional frog leaping away as I approached. It was perfect, serene, almost like stepping into another world. I took my time marking the trails I walked on, making mental notes so I could find my way back easily. It was on the third night that I noticed something unusual. I was preparing my meal, the stove crackling warmly, when I thought I heard a faint thump outside. I paused, straining to hear over the wind and the fire. Nothing. I shook it off, thinking it was just a branch falling or perhaps an animal. The woods were alive with sound. It was nothing to worry about. I finished my dinner and went to bed, leaving the cabin dark except for the thin beam of my lantern on the nightstand. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach tighten. One of the chairs near the small dining table was moved slightly from where I had left it. I knew I had placed it flush against the wall the night before. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had moved it without thinking. Maybe it shifted when I cleaned. But the uneasy feeling lingered. I made a mental note to check the locks on the doors, though I had no reason to suspect anyone had been in the cabin. Over the next few days, small things began to appear that I could not easily explain. A footprint in the dirt near the back door, faint but distinct, smaller than mine. Some supplies I was sure I had left in the pantry were slightly out of place. One morning, I found my firewood stacked differently than I had left it the night before. Each instance by itself could be dismissed. Taken together, they formed a pattern that made my pulse quicken. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks in the isolation, but deep down, a knot of fear began to form in my chest. By the fifth day, I became hyper-aware of every sound. The wind that night seemed louder, the rustling of leaves sharper. My cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt fragile and exposed. Every creak of the wooden floor made me flinch. I started checking the doors and windows repeatedly, making sure they were locked, imagining shadows in every corner. I even began placing my knife near my bed, just in case. It was early morning on the sixth day when I saw him, or at least the signs that someone had been there recently. I stepped outside to fetch water from the creek, the mist still clinging to the ground, and noticed footprints in the soft mud along the edge. They were fresh, the mud still slightly damp, and they led from the tree line straight to the cabin. My heart sank. They didn't match my boots. They were smaller. They stopped abruptly near the back door. I went back inside quickly, locking everything, checking every window, the fireplace, even the vents. There was no sign of forced entry, but the footprints told me someone had been close, perhaps even inside. Panic was creeping in, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. I wasn't going to be caught off guard. I grabbed my bag, filled with essentials, and set up a makeshift defense. A chair wedged against the door, knives placed at strategic points. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening intently to the shifting sounds of the forest. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay passive any longer. I had to know if someone was actually living around the cabin or if it was a one-time intrusion. I ventured into the woods cautiously, scanning for anything unusual. That's when I found the clearing. It wasn't far from the cabin, just a short walk through the trees. There, hidden among the brambles and overgrown grass, was a small makeshift shelter. Rudimentary, crude, clearly built recently. Empty cans, tattered blankets, and other supplies scattered around made it obvious someone had been living there for days, maybe weeks. The realization hit me like a punch in the stomach. I wasn't alone. Someone had been observing the cabin, the way they had moved my things, stacked my firewood. I didn't know why, but I knew it wasn't random. I returned to the cabin, careful not to leave obvious tracks. I knew I needed a plan, something practical. Panic wouldn't help me. I spent the day preparing. I gathered extra firewood, made sure I had water stored, and cleaned and sharpened my knives. I also made a small trip back to the clearing in the woods, marking the path mentally, just so I knew where it was. I realized I had to be ready for anything. That night, I stayed alert. The forest was dark and heavy, each sound amplified in the stillness. I had eaten sparingly, conserving energy, keeping myself sharp. Around midnight, I heard movement near the back of the cabin. Not subtle, not random, deliberate. My heart raced, and I gripped my knife tightly. I didn't move, waiting, every muscle tense. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. Footsteps on the wooden deck. I held my breath. I decided to confront the situation with logic, not recklessness. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. What I saw made my stomach drop. A man, thin, ragged, crouching near the back door, holding something that looked like a crude tool or stick. His eyes widened as he saw the light, and for a moment, everything froze. I realized I had an advantage. He had no idea I was prepared, I was calm, and he was caught. Instead of panicking, I stayed still and made myself visible. He hesitated, unsure, then slowly backed away, retreating into the woods without making a sound. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. The immediate danger had passed, but I knew I couldn't stay another night in the cabin alone. The next morning, I left. I packed everything, checking multiple times that I had my essentials, and took the dirt road back to civilization. I called the local authorities as soon as I had signal, reporting what I had found: the makeshift shelter, the footprints, and the encounter. They assured me they would investigate. Driving away, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The cabin had been beautiful, the woods peaceful, but the experience taught me something vital. Isolation has a thin line between serenity and vulnerability. I wasn't ready for it in the way I had imagined. I thought about what had happened constantly during the drive back, analyzing every detail, replaying the encounter, and thinking about what I could have done differently. When I finally returned home, I spent days unpacking, cleaning, and slowly reintegrating into the city. Sleep came easier now, without the constant fear that someone was nearby. But the memory of those woods, the quiet tension, and the man hiding in the shadows stayed with me. I had gone seeking peace and solitude, and I had found it, but not without understanding how fragile it truly was. I never returned to the cabin. I kept the photograph I had taken of the clearing in the woods in a drawer, a reminder that nature is never truly empty, and isolation always comes with risk. Over time, the fear dulled, replaced with respect for the wilderness and the realization that human caution is just as important as bravery. I learned to plan, to prepare, and to never take solitude for granted. The cabin, the forest, and that week of tension had changed me, left me wiser, and made me grateful for the safety and clarity of returning home. The experience stayed with me for years, an indelible memory of how real danger can exist in the quietest places, and how awareness, preparation, and calm thinking can turn fear into survival. I often revisited that time in my mind, not with terror, but with clarity and respect. I had faced a threat, handled it, and returned whole. The ending, while tense, was complete, and I knew I had learned lessons no city life could ever teach me. I had been planning this trip for months, ever since I found a small listing for a cabin deep in the forest, far from the usual trails and the weekend crowds. It was the kind of place that promised peace, isolation, and the chance to disappear into silence for a few days. I didn't really need that much, just a few notebooks, my camera, and enough food and water to last a week. I had been under stress at work, drowning in numbers, deadlines, and endless small emergencies, and I wanted a chance to step away, to be alone without any interruptions. The drive was long, more than 3 hours along twisting, narrow roads, through small towns that seemed like they had been frozen in the 1970s, and finally into dense forest where the pavement ended and the road turned into gravel. My old car rumbled over the stones, and I noticed early signs that this forest was different from the more popular hiking areas I had been to. The trees grew thick and tall, their branches forming a roof over the road. There were no signs, no other cars, no people. Even the birds seemed quieter here, almost hidden in the shadows between the trunks. The cabin itself was smaller than I had expected but solid, made of rough logs with a steep roof, a stone chimney, and a small porch that sagged in the middle. The surrounding forest felt ancient, thick with undergrowth, fallen branches, and moss-covered rocks. I parked in front, grabbed my backpack, and stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and dust, and there was an immediate sense of heaviness in the room, as though it hadn't been lived in for weeks. The furniture was sparse: an old wooden table, a couple of chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves lined with the remnants of past visitors. A few books, a jar of nails, and a half-used bottle of cleaning solution. I spent the first day settling in. I unpacked my food, arranged my clothes, and explored the cabin room by room. The windows looked out onto the forest, which seemed to press against the walls, almost alive with movement and sound. By afternoon, I had walked around the perimeter, noting the way the terrain sloped down to a small creek that ran behind the cabin. The water gurgled quietly over the rocks, and I could see occasional fish darting under the surface. Everything seemed calm, almost too calm. I reminded myself that isolation was the whole point. Night came quickly. The sun sank behind the trees, leaving long shadows and a deepening darkness that the cabin's single oil lamp barely cut through. I had brought matches and firewood, so I lit a fire in the stone fireplace. The warmth was comforting, but the crackling flames threw moving shadows against the walls, making familiar shapes seem unfamiliar. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and groaning through the trees. I lay on the bed, trying to read a book, but every sound felt sharper, closer, somehow threatening. Outside, a branch snapped. I froze, listening. A small animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, I told myself, but my stomach tightened. The isolation was suddenly heavier. The first night passed without incident, but it was restless. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made me sit upright and strain my ears. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, just the forest moving, but the feeling of being watched lingered. By morning, I was on edge, checking the windows and doors to make sure everything was locked and secure. The sun brought some relief, but I noticed small things that made me uneasy. Footprints near the creek that I hadn't seen the day before, shallow impressions in the dirt that were too large to be from any small animal. I decided to spend the day hiking. The forest around the cabin was dense, with narrow paths that twisted between trees and over roots. I had a map and a compass, and I thought I knew the general layout of the area, but it was easy to get turned around. As I walked, I noticed that the forest seemed to change. The trees grew even closer together, their trunks forming walls on either side of the narrow trail. I felt the sun being blocked out by the thick canopy, leaving everything dim and shadowed. The air was damp and heavy. I tried to focus on my footing, but the quiet was oppressive, broken only by distant bird calls and the occasional crack of a branch. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was low, and the shadows in the forest were long and dark. I noticed something new, a faint track in the dirt leading from the cabin to the woods, like someone had walked there recently. My heart rate spiked. There should be no one here. I hadn't seen another human all day, and the nearest road was miles away. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker from earlier, maybe an animal, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. That night, I barely slept. Every noise was amplified. The wind, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant snap that could have been a branch or a footstep. I kept imagining shapes outside the windows, people or animals moving through the darkness. Around midnight, I woke to a noise that was unmistakable. A soft scraping sound against the side of the cabin, like someone dragging something across the wood. My pulse raced. I stayed still, listening. The sound stopped, then started again on the other side. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't an animal. I realized then that someone might actually be here. My mind raced, trying to remember if I had locked all the doors. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers shaking, and shone it toward the window. There was nothing, only the blackness of the forest. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate. I grabbed a heavy metal poker from the fireplace, holding it in both hands, ready to defend myself. The minutes felt like hours. I thought about running, but my car was parked in front of the cabin, and to reach it I would have to cross the open area outside, fully visible. By dawn, the noises stopped. I checked the perimeter carefully, walking around the cabin. There were footprints in the soft dirt, much larger than mine, circling the cabin and then disappearing into the forest. I took a deep breath. I couldn't stay in the cabin if someone was out there, but leaving on the road that led into the forest seemed even worse. I had no cell service, no immediate way to call for help. I felt trapped, surrounded, and utterly alone. I decided to stay put during the day, gathering supplies and preparing for the possibility that I would need to defend myself through the night. I moved furniture against the doors, stocked my pockets with knives, and filled every container I had with water. I found a small axe in a corner of the shed outside and carried it with me, a last resort in case the person or people came back. I didn't sleep that day, sitting near the fire and watching the windows, listening to every sound. Night came again, darker and colder than before. I built a fire and kept it going, the flames my only protection against the oppressive darkness. Around midnight, the noises returned, but this time they were accompanied by a low, muffled sound, almost like whispering, though I knew no one was speaking. The scraping was closer now, right against the cabin walls. I gripped the axe tightly. My mind raced through every scenario I could imagine. I thought about breaking a window and escaping into the forest, but the darkness was impenetrable, and the thought of running blind terrified me. Hours passed. I kept a watchful eye on every shadow, every tree outside the windows. The noises faded, then returned, moving around the cabin, circling, testing. I realized they weren't random, they were deliberate. Someone was trying to intimidate me, to make me panic. My heart ached from fear, and my mind struggled to stay calm. I forced myself to focus on small tasks, checking the fire, rearranging supplies, sharpening the knives. Keeping busy helped, but only just. Morning finally came, pale light filtering through the thick canopy. I was exhausted, my body trembling from tension and lack of sleep. I forced myself to go outside, walking slowly around the cabin, inspecting the ground. The footprints from the night before were still there, but this time I noticed something I hadn't before. The prints stopped abruptly a few meters from the cabin, as though whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. There were no drag marks, no broken branches, no signs of where they might have gone. It was unnerving. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed quickly, leaving nothing behind except a few random items that wouldn't matter. I checked the locks, secured the windows as best I could, and grabbed my backpack. I started walking toward the gravel road, following the map I had brought. Every step felt tense. I was hyper-aware of every sound. The forest seemed alive, watching me. Branches cracked under my feet. A deer bolted through the trees, and I kept imagining the footsteps returning behind me. After several hours, I finally reached the road. I could see the faint outline of my car in the distance. Relief flooded through me. I ran the last stretch, fumbling with the keys, and climbed inside. I locked the doors, sat in the driver's seat, and finally allowed myself to breathe. The forest loomed behind me, silent again, but I knew it had been watching all along. I drove back slowly, keeping the windows closed and the doors locked, thinking about what had happened. It was clear now. Someone had been in the area, living or camping without my knowledge. They had circled the cabin, watched me, tried to scare me away. I hadn't seen them clearly, but their presence had been undeniable. The thought of it made me shiver even hours later, long after I had returned to the paved roads and passing cars. By the time I reached the nearest town, sunlight was high, and the world felt normal again. People walked on sidewalks, Cars moved along streets, and everything seemed safe. I bought coffee and sat in a small diner, watching ordinary life unfold around me, trying to shake the memory of the forest and the cabin. I knew I had escaped something dangerous, something I might never understand fully. Weeks later, I returned to the area, but only to report what I had seen. Local authorities checked the area and found evidence of someone living illegally in the forest. Makeshift shelters, discarded items, and signs of a presence near the cabin. No one had been caught, and there were no reports of attacks on anyone else. It was a relief, but it didn't erase the memory. I never returned to that cabin, never went back to that part of the forest. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder of the thin line between solitude and danger. I realized that isolation, the very thing I had sought, could quickly become a trap. It taught me to be cautious, to respect the unknown, and to never underestimate how close danger could be, even in places that seemed peaceful. I never forgot the scraping at the windows, the footprints in the dirt, or the feeling of being watched. And even now, years later, I feel a chill remembering how quiet the forest was before it became alive with someone else's presence. In the end, I survived because I stayed alert, because I trusted my instincts, and because I refused to panic. I didn't need weapons beyond what I had, and I didn't need luck, only awareness and calm. The cabin remained empty after that, but I never went back. I kept my memories, my careful habits, and the knowledge that some places, no matter how inviting, are dangerous simply because we are alone in them. I had been driving all day, taking back roads through the mountains to reach a cabin I had rented for the weekend. The GPS signal had been spotty for hours, flickering on and off, and the narrow, winding road left me gripping the steering wheel tighter than I wanted to admit. By the time I finally saw the cabin, a small, weathered structure set back from the road, almost swallowed by tall pines and thick underbrush, it was late afternoon. The sky was a pale, fading gray, heavy with clouds that hinted at rain. The smell of wet earth and pine needles filled the air, sharp and clean. It was exactly the kind of solitude I had wanted, far away from the city noise and the endless stream of messages and obligations. The cabin itself was simple, a single room with a loft above, built of rough logs with dark stains from age. The windows were small and dusty, the wood of the porch creaking under my feet. There was no electricity, only a wood-burning stove and a stack of firewood neatly piled near the door. I set down my bags and stepped inside, immediately aware of the smell of dampness, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The floorboards groaned as I walked, the only light coming from the gray sky outside. I set about unpacking, trying to shake the fatigue from the long drive, and built a small fire in the stove. The warmth and smell of burning would make the cabin feel a little less empty, a little less like I was completely alone. I spent the next hour exploring the surroundings. The cabin was on a slight incline, with dense forest stretching on all sides. There was a narrow trail leading downhill toward a stream I could hear before I saw it, water rushing over rocks, hidden among ferns and moss. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, but the deeper I went, the quieter it became. By the time I returned to the cabin, dusk had begun to settle, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and dark across the ground. I had intended to make dinner outside on a small camping stove, but the chill in the air and the gathering darkness made me decide to eat inside. That night, the wind picked up. It rattled the windows and shook the loose boards of the cabin. I kept the fire going, the flames throwing long, flickering shadows across the walls. Outside, the forest moaned and groaned with the wind, branches scraping against each other like fingernails. I tried to read a book, but the noise made it hard to concentrate. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I laid down on the narrow bed in the loft, pulling the blankets tightly around me. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking to the sound of the wind, of branches snapping, of the occasional rustle in the underbrush. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, soft and deliberate, but the sound faded before I could be sure. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or an animal moving nearby. The cabin was old and creaky, and the forest was full of life after all. But even as I forced my eyes closed, a small knot of unease stayed in my chest. Morning brought gray light and rain. The clouds had thickened overnight, and the wind still blew, cold and steady. I dressed quickly, put on my rain jacket, and went outside to check the surroundings. The ground was slick with mud, and the stream below the cabin had swollen slightly. The trees were bending in the wind, their trunks groaning with strain. As I walked along the small trail, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A set of footprints in the mud, leading from the woods toward the cabin. They were not animal tracks. They were large, human. I froze, trying to convince myself they were old, left from someone who had been here before me. But the mud was fresh, soft, and the prints looked recent. They stopped at the edge of the clearing near the cabin and then continued toward the door, stopping at the step where I had left my boots the night before. My heart beat faster. I wasn't expecting anyone here. The cabin was isolated, and I hadn't told anyone I was coming. Who could have been here, and why hadn't I seen them? I went inside, feeling exposed despite the walls around me. I checked the locks on the door and windows. Everything seemed intact, but the unease stayed with me. I tried to distract myself with chores, stacking firewood, checking my supplies, making coffee on the small camping stove. Each creak of the cabin made me jump. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that the footprints were old or left by someone passing by long before. But the rational part of my mind was struggling against the growing tension in my body. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and heavy. I decided to take a walk down the trail to clear my head, though I stayed close to the cabin, not wanting to get lost in the wet forest. The path was slippery, lined with mud and fallen leaves. I moved slowly, my eyes scanning the trees. The wind had died down, but now the forest was eerily silent. No birds, no insects, nothing but the soft splash of my boots in the mud. That's when I noticed the movement, small, deliberate. A figure standing among the trees, partially hidden, watching me. My first instinct was to tell myself it was an animal, but the shape was too straight, too deliberate. I froze, heart hammering, and the figure didn't move. Then, just as suddenly, it stepped back and disappeared into the trees. I wanted to run, to retreat to the cabin, but my feet felt heavy. I made my way back cautiously, scanning the forest for any sign of the figure. When I reached the cabin, everything seemed normal. The door was closed, the windows intact, but the knot of fear in my chest was now tight and burning. I tried to stay calm. I locked the door, barricaded it with a heavy chair, and sat by the stove, watching the shadows. Night came slowly, heavy and dark. I kept the fire burning as long as possible, rationing the wood I had brought. Outside, the forest seemed alive with subtle movement. Branches swaying, leaves brushing against each other, shadows darting at the edge of the clearing. Every sound made me flinch, and every gust of wind felt like someone moving just beyond the trees. I didn't sleep, couldn't. My mind ran over every possibility, every scenario of what could happen. The next morning, I resolved to leave. I packed quickly, keeping my eyes on the forest the entire time. As I reached the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, scratched into the mud near the driver's side door, was a series of marks, deliberate and deep. They weren't footprints. They were scratches, long and jagged, as if someone had dragged something sharp across the ground. They ended at the tire tracks where my car had been parked. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't stop to investigate. I didn't even look back as I drove down the muddy road, rain beginning to fall again. It was hours before I felt safe. I didn't see another soul on the road. The forest seemed endless behind me, dense and quiet, hiding whatever had been there. I reached a small town by evening, light spilling from the windows of homes and shops, the streets filled with people. The sense of relief was immediate, but so was the lingering fear. I couldn't explain what had happened, what had been watching me, or why. All I knew was that I had been alone, truly alone, in a place where someone or something could have been lurking just out of sight. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of those footprints, of the figure in the trees, of the scratches by the car. I researched the area and found stories of break-ins at cabins, of squatters hiding in the woods, waiting for someone to arrive. Nothing confirmed what I had seen, but the possibility was enough to keep me on edge. I realized that the wilderness wasn't just quiet and beautiful. It could be dangerous in ways I hadn't considered. Isolation amplified fear, and even a simple cabin in the woods could become a trap if someone with bad intentions was nearby. I returned once, months later, during the day, when the forest seemed safe and empty. The cabin was abandoned, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. The firewood had rotted, the walls were streaked with water damage, and the mud was thick from winter rains. There was no sign of the figure, no fresh footprints. I explored cautiously, taking photographs and checking every corner. It was empty, but the sense of unease stayed with me. I realized then that safety was fragile. The world outside the city was vast, beautiful, and unpredictable. Trust had to be earned, and solitude had to be respected. From that experience, I learned caution. I never went back to that area at night, never stayed alone in an isolated cabin again. I made sure someone knew where I was always. I carried tools, stayed alert, and never ignored the warning signs. Fear was a useful guide, a reminder that I was vulnerable and that the world could change in an instant. That cabin had been a test of my awareness, my preparedness, and my ability to respond under pressure. I came away with a heightened sense of vigilance, a respect for the unknown, and a clear understanding that sometimes the scariest things are not supernatural. They are real, immediate, and just beyond the trees. Years later, I still think about that cabin, the shadow in the trees, and the marks in the mud. I remember the quiet terror of being truly alone, surrounded by a forest that could hide anyone or anything. But I also remember the relief of leaving, the clarity that came from surviving the experience, and the sense of empowerment that comes from facing fear and making it out intact. The cabin stayed behind, silent and weathered, waiting for the next person who might wander too far, who might not notice the signs, who might learn the same lesson in the same way I had. That nature is indifferent. People can be dangerous, and solitude, while beautiful, carries risks that must never be ignored. Even now, when I think back, I feel the cold dampness of the air, the rough texture of the cabin walls, the muffled sounds of the forest pressing in. But I also feel the relief, the understanding, and the hard-earned calm that comes from surviving something that had the power to break me. I don't romanticize the experience. It wasn't an adventure in the way I had imagined. It was a lesson, raw and unfiltered, in the importance of awareness, preparation, and respect for the real dangers that exist outside the controlled environment of daily life. And that, I realized, was far scarier and far more valuable than any story I could have imagined. I had been planning the trip for months, alone in the middle of nowhere, in a cabin deep in the woods. I wanted isolation, peace, and the kind of quiet you never get in the city. I had read the weather report carefully, packed supplies for a week, and made sure my car was in perfect condition. The directions were precise. A narrow dirt road winding through the forest, turning into smaller and smaller tracks until the trees seemed to close around you. By the time I parked at the small clearing in front of the cabin, the sun was dipping low, painting the trees in gold and orange. The cabin itself was old but solid, with a stone chimney and wooden siding that had aged to a soft gray. I had seen pictures online, but seeing it in person was different. It had a kind of quiet weight to it, a stillness that pressed against you the closer you got. I carried my bags inside, feeling the sudden chill that always comes when stepping into an empty and used house. The air smelled faintly of wood polish, dust, and something older, like the slow decay of forgotten things. I set my bags down and began to unpack. I had brought canned food, dry supplies, firewood stacked neatly outside, and my own water. The cabin had a small stove, a basic refrigerator, and a table with 2 chairs. A loft held a single bed with a thin mattress, and the living room had a small couch and a few shelves of books. Everything looked intact, but slightly neglected. I felt a thrill of anticipation. The first evening passed quietly. I made a simple meal, lit the fireplace, and watched the flames flicker against the walls. Outside, the forest was dark, but not completely silent. I could hear leaves rustling, branches shifting, and the occasional distant call of a bird or a fox. It was peaceful, and I went to bed early, falling asleep to the sound of the wind through the trees. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the small window. I ate a quick breakfast and decided to explore the surrounding woods. The trees were dense, their trunks thick and tangled with vines. The air was cool, sharp, and carried the smell of pine and damp earth. I walked for hours, following small trails, climbing gentle slopes, and occasionally finding animal tracks. It was easy to lose track of time. By the afternoon, I had wandered farther than I intended. When I finally turned back, I realized that the forest had changed. Paths I thought I remembered seemed different, and the sun had moved lower than I expected. I felt a slight tension in my chest but shrugged it off, telling myself I had simply underestimated the distance. I kept walking, trying to retrace my steps, but something felt off. The trees seemed denser here, their branches lower, and the shadows longer and darker. I found myself slowing, my ears straining for any sound that might indicate a way back. Hours passed, and panic began to creep in. The forest looked unfamiliar. Every turn seemed to lead to another wall of trees. I realized I had no idea where I was. My phone had no signal. I tried to stay calm, remembering the basic survival techniques I had read about. Follow a stream, climb to higher ground, or wait for the sun to show the way. I spotted a small stream and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead back to the cabin. The walk along the stream was slow and exhausting. My boots sank into the soft mud, and the water occasionally sprayed my legs. The forest seemed silent now, almost unnaturally so, except for the sound of my own movements. The sky was turning orange with sunset, and I realized that darkness would arrive soon. I began to feel cold in spite of my layers. Anxiety gnawed at me. As night fell, I knew I had to find shelter. The forest was too dense to see any distant lights, and the stream led only to more trees. I spotted a small clearing, just large enough to make a temporary camp. I gathered branches and dry leaves to make a small fire. Lighting it was difficult. My hands were shaking, and the damp wood kept smoking without catching. Eventually, I managed a weak flame that gave off minimal heat. The firelight danced against the trees, and I felt suddenly exposed. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the movement of small animals, made my heart jump. I realized how alone I truly was. There was no one for miles, no way to call for help, and the forest seemed endless. I wrapped myself in a thermal blanket and tried to sleep next to the fire, but exhaustion made it impossible. I stayed awake, listening, every nerve alert. Morning came slowly. I had slept in short bursts, waking at every sound. My first thought was to find the cabin. I walked along the stream again, hoping to recognize any landmark. Hours passed, my legs sore, my mind weary. Then, in the distance, I saw a roof partially hidden by trees. Relief washed over me. I ran toward it, careful not to trip in my exhaustion. The cabin looked unchanged, serene, almost welcoming. I pushed the door open and collapsed inside. I checked the rooms, everything intact, the way I had left it. The fireplace had a few remaining embers from the previous day. I felt safe, but I also felt a deep sense of vulnerability. I had been hours from help, surrounded by miles of forest, completely dependent on my own skills and judgment. Over the next days, I stayed close to the cabin. I organized my supplies, reinforced the door and windows, and made small traps for catching firewood without disturbing the surrounding forest. I explored short distances, marking trees to avoid getting lost again. Each night, I built a strong fire and kept it burning as long as possible. The forest remained alive with sounds: distant owls, rustling leaves, and occasional deer. The realization that I had survived the first ordeal gave me a fragile sense of confidence. On the third night, a storm rolled in. Rain pelted the roof, and wind rattled the walls. I secured everything inside, stacking extra wood near the fireplace, tying the door with rope and checking the windows. Water seeped through a few cracks, but it was manageable. The storm lasted hours, and I sat by the fire, keeping it alive despite the danger. At one point, a large branch fell nearby with a crash, making the cabin shake. I felt my heart in my throat but kept calm, knowing that panicking would do me no good. The next morning, the forest was slick and muddy. Trees had fallen, and the path I had used earlier was partially blocked. I realized that leaving would be harder now. I checked my supplies and planned carefully. I had enough food and water, and I could wait for the storm to clear. I stayed inside, performing small maintenance tasks, keeping a low profile and monitoring the weather. By the fourth day, the storm had passed, but the forest had changed. Branches were broken, puddles had formed, and the once familiar paths were altered. I took my time retracing my steps back to the main dirt road, staying alert for unstable ground and fallen trees. I moved cautiously, relying on my previous markings and careful observation. By late afternoon, I finally reached the clearing where I had parked my car. Relief washed over me, stronger than before. I loaded my bags and supplies into the car, careful not to slip on the mud. As I drove away, I looked back at the forest. It was quiet again, serene, but now I saw it with respect, understanding the power and isolation it held. The cabin had been a refuge, a place of survival, but the forest was vast and indifferent. The drive back to civilization was slow, my mind replaying every detail, every moment of fear and exhaustion. I realized how unprepared I had been for simple mistakes like underestimating distances or failing to mark my path clearly. But I also felt a sense of accomplishment. I had faced complete isolation, survived hunger, exhaustion, fear, and a storm, and had returned safely. When I finally reached a town and saw people again, the sounds of life felt almost overwhelming. I parked at a small diner, ordered a meal, and sat for hours, letting the normalcy sink in. I thought about the cabin, the forest, and the quiet terror of being alone, and I realized I had learned something profound. Survival is not just about tools or preparation, but about awareness, patience, and respect for your surroundings. Weeks later, I returned home, unpacked, and cleaned my gear. The memory of the cabin stayed with me, not as a fairy tale or a story of ghosts, but as a lesson in realism, resilience, and the raw power of nature. I kept a small photo of the cabin on my shelf, a reminder that fear can be real, but it can also be overcome with focus, calm, and careful planning. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more thoughtful in the outdoors, but I also grew more confident in my ability to handle unexpected challenges. I had faced fear in its purest, most human form. Not supernatural, not imagined, but real, raw, and unforgiving, and I had emerged whole. That cabin, those woods, and those days alone taught me more about life, endurance, and human resilience than I could have learned anywhere else. From that point forward, every time I plan a trip or face an unknown situation, I remember the cabin. I remember the panic, the fear, the exhaustion, but also the strategy, the calm, and the careful steps that brought me back to safety. And every time I do, I am reminded that survival is not about luck, but about attention, respect, and perseverance. I remember the drive clearly, though the memory has grown sharper over time. The sky had been gray and low, the kind of sky that presses down on the road, making the forest look heavier, older, and darker than it really was. I had left the city early in the morning, the roads almost empty, my car loaded with camping gear I'd borrowed from a friend who insisted I needed the full survival experience. The cabin was supposed to be a remote getaway, a place to disconnect from the world and think in silence. That's what the listing promised. Pictures showed a small wooden cabin perched by a lake, surrounded by thick pine trees. The air in those photos seemed crisp, the lake calm, a mirror of the sky. By the time I reached the last stretch of gravel road, the sky had darkened even further. Thick clouds hung low, and the wind whispered through the trees in a way that felt almost alive. The road narrowed into something barely more than a track, lined with fallen branches and hidden ruts. I had to drive slowly, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, heart thudding. I remember thinking, for the first time, that maybe isolation carried a weight no city street could compare to. The cabin appeared suddenly, almost as if it had grown from the forest itself. It was simple, made of dark timber, with a stone chimney and a small porch that faced the lake. The windows were dirty but not broken. No smoke rose from the chimney, no sign of life besides the quiet sway of the trees. I parked my car on the uneven ground in front, the tires sinking slightly into damp soil. There was a heavy smell in the air, a mixture of pine, wet earth, and something else I couldn't identify immediately. Inside, the cabin was darker than I expected. The windows let in some light, but it was filtered through the gray clouds, leaving everything in a muted, greenish-brown hue. Dust coated every surface. The smell inside was different from outside, stronger, with hints of old wood, mold, and the faint metallic tang of something decaying. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I explored. The cabin had a single room that served as living space, a small kitchen corner, and a loft bedroom above, accessible by a steep ladder. There was a stone fireplace, cold and empty, and a table with 2 chairs, both unsteady. I set down my backpack and went to inspect the supplies I had brought. Food, water, matches, a lantern, and a sleeping bag. I unpacked methodically, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to move in the corners of the room, stretching unnaturally with the dim light. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows and making the cabin groan in response. I remember thinking that the cabin felt alive in a way that was entirely physical. Every board, every crack, every window seemed to respond to the wind, to the weight of the roof. Night fell quickly. I had intended to light the fireplace and make some tea, but the wood was damp, soaked by weeks of rain. I tried anyway, striking match after match, but the logs smoked and hissed without catching. The cold crept into my bones. I bundled myself in the sleeping bag on the loft, the ladder below me creaking ominously every time the wind hit the cabin just right. I remember lying awake, listening. First, it was the wind, sighing through the trees. Then, subtle but unmistakable, came another sound, the soft, dragging shuffle of something moving outside, across the ground, among the leaves. I froze, straining to hear, but the sound stopped almost immediately. My pulse raced. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving through the brush. The forest was full of animals. But the sound returned, slower this time, deliberate, almost cautious. It came from the back of the cabin, the side facing the trees rather than the lake. I stayed completely still, heart hammering, ears straining. I debated my next move. I considered climbing down to check, but the idea of walking into the dark alone, with something moving out there, made me feel like a fool. I remembered the lantern and grabbed it, lighting it carefully. The small flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. I took the first step down the ladder, each rung groaning under my weight. I moved slowly, listening. The dragging sound had stopped again. I reached the floor and crept toward the back door, every step slow, deliberate. The door was old, wooden, with a simple latch. I held my breath and tried to peer out into the darkness. The trees were dense, shadows blending into each other. My eyes strained to see, but the darkness seemed to press in, hiding everything. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, too large to be a small animal, too deliberate to be random. Paused, then disappeared. I backed away from the door and leaned against the wall, heart racing. I had no signal on my phone, no way to call for help. Panic rose in my chest, tight and suffocating. I realized I had underestimated how alone I truly was. The forest wasn't just silent. It was full of things I couldn't see, things that could move quietly through the undergrowth. I spent the rest of the night in the loft, wrapped tightly in my sleeping bag, clutching a kitchen knife I had brought, just in case. Every sound, the wind, the creaking boards, the occasional snap of a branch, made me jump. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, Morning brought no relief. The sky was gray still, but the wind had died down. I climbed down cautiously, deciding to explore the perimeter of the cabin in daylight. As I stepped outside, the ground around the cabin looked disturbed. Footprints, too large for deer, irregular, almost human, crisscrossed the mud. Some were fresh. I felt a cold wave of realization. I wasn't alone here. I spent the day fortifying the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture against doors and windows, checked the locks, and prepared more firewood. I avoided looking at the forest, focusing instead on routine, the tangible tasks I could control. But the sense of being watched never left. Every time I stepped outside to fetch wood or check the perimeter, I felt eyes on me. Shadows moved between the trees even when the light was good, shapes that seemed almost human but always just beyond clear sight. By the second night, the fear had settled into something heavier, almost tangible. I had eaten little, my stomach tight, my mind racing. The dragging sound returned, low and slow, circling the cabin as I lay in the loft. This time it came closer. I could hear the scrape of something across the wooden porch, then the faint smell of smoke and dampness mixed with something acrid, metallic, that made me gag. My thoughts spun. Someone could be out there, watching, maybe even planning. I had to stay awake. The night passed in a haze of fear. I didn't sleep. Every noise, every shadow, felt like an immediate threat. At one point, I thought I saw a figure at the edge of the trees, tall, dark, motionless. I froze, knowing movement might draw attention. The figure didn't move, and eventually, the first hint of gray light crept over the horizon. When morning came, I had to make a decision. Staying felt dangerous. Leaving would mean navigating the forest roads alone. I packed quickly, gathering my backpack, my supplies, and the few things I could carry. The forest seemed to close in as I walked, branches scratching at my arms, roots tripping me. I moved toward the road, trying to make as little noise as possible. It was then I saw the tracks in the mud leading away from the cabin, deeper into the trees. Larger than mine, messy, as if whoever or whatever had been there had walked in a hurry. Fear gripped me again. I kept moving, faster now, until I reached the gravel road. The car was still where I had parked it, tires sunk slightly into the soft ground. I climbed in, started the engine, and drove, heart hammering, scanning the trees as I left. The road back to the highway felt endless. I dared not stop. The forest seemed to watch, waiting for me to falter. Every branch that scraped the side of the car, every shadow that flitted across the road, made me flinch. Hours later, when I finally reached a gas station, the lights of civilization were like a beacon. I parked and sat in the car, shaking, unable to move. I called the local authorities and told them where I had been, describing the tracks and the cabin. They noted it but warned me that remote areas were dangerous and often used by poachers or squatters. Eventually, I returned home. The images of the cabin, the shadows, the tracks, stayed with me. But over time, I took comfort in the fact that I had survived through observation, caution, and sheer will. I learned a hard lesson about isolation, about the unexpected dangers of the natural world, and about respecting the unknown limits of safety. I never returned to that cabin, and I have never camped alone in a remote area since. I still dream about the forest, the dragging sounds, and the shadow at the edge of the trees. But now, the fear has a shape, a reminder to be prepared, alert, and respectful of the wild. Even though it was terrifying, the experience left me with a strange clarity. Life in the city felt fragile after that. I learned how to read the wind through the trees, how to judge the sounds of animals, and how to act calmly under pressure. I understood that survival often depends less on bravery and more on patience, awareness, and the careful observation of detail. And though I will always remember the shadowy figure near the cabin, I know that the most frightening part wasn't the possibility of someone being out there. It was realizing how unprepared I had been, how fragile my sense of control really was, and how quickly the familiar could become dangerous. I remember the first time I saw the cabin, though at the time I didn't realize how much it would change the way I looked at being alone. It wasn't marked on any map I could find, not on the tourist maps, not even on the old logging maps I had scavenged from a local library. It stood at the far edge of a stretch of national forest, a squat structure of weathered logs and a steeply pitched roof, the kind that looked like it might have been abandoned for years. I had found it while hiking a trail I had been following for hours, a narrow footpath through thick evergreens that bent low with the weight of years of snowfall and storms. The trees pressed in on the trail from both sides, their trunks thick with moss, their roots tangling the ground beneath my boots so that every step required careful attention. The day I arrived, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds, and the forest smelled damp, a smell of wet pine and rotting leaves. I had been hiking for close to 12 hours without stopping, and the idea of a cabin, even one that looked like it might collapse at the slightest touch, was enough to pull me off the trail. I pushed through the underbrush, the twigs and needles scratching my legs, until I stood at the cabin's threshold. The door was slightly ajar, hanging on rusty hinges, and I paused, unsure whether I should even approach. I told myself that it didn't matter. A dry place to rest, maybe to get out of the wind if the storm I felt brewing passed through, was worth the risk. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and mildew, the air stale and heavy. Dust covered every surface in a thick layer, and I could see the tracks of small animals. Mice, maybe squirrels, where they had scuttled along the floor. The main room had a fireplace, cold and full of ashes that were years old, and a table made of rough logs, one leg shorter than the others so that it wobbled when I leaned on it. There were shelves nailed to the walls, empty except for a few rusted tin cans and shards of broken pottery. The windows were grimy and partially cracked, letting in just enough light to illuminate the room without making it feel warm. I set my pack down and took stock of what I had. Water, a small stove, some canned beans, and a few other basics. I had brought a tent, but the idea of sleeping inside a real shelter, even one as decrepit as this cabin, made me feel a little safer. I spent the next hour clearing a corner of debris and laying out my sleeping bag. The storm I had smelled earlier began in earnest as I was finishing. Rain hammered the roof and windows, and wind gusted through the cracks so that the cabin shivered around me. I felt a twinge of fear, a small prickling at the back of my neck, but I pushed it aside. This was isolation, yes, but it was the kind I had chosen. I had been hiking alone for weeks at this point, and I had learned to manage fear, to live with it without letting it take hold. Night fell, heavy and complete, and the sound of the forest outside became more pronounced. Rain pattered on the roof, branches scratched against the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a tree fell with a deep, resonant crack. I lay in my sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling, listening to the noises, trying to sort out which were natural and which, my mind inevitably insisted, could be something else. I reminded myself that animals could do anything, that a deer, a raccoon, or even a bear could brush against the cabin in ways that sounded alarming. Still, I could not fully shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was around 2 in the morning when I heard the first real sign that something was off. Not a noise that suggested an animal or the wind, but a subtle, deliberate sound. A scratch at the door. Slow, steady, and low like claws against wood. I froze, muscles tense, heartbeat echoing in my ears. I had brought a knife, a small fixed blade, but I didn't want to jump at shadows. The scratch repeated, a pattern, deliberate. I held my breath and listened. Then silence. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a raccoon, maybe the door shifting, but the sound had been too calculated. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, listening to every noise, counting the minutes until first light. The morning came, pale and gray, with the storm receding into a mist that hung among the trees like smoke. I ventured outside, heart still pounding, to check the perimeter. There were no footprints in the mud other than mine, no sign that anyone else had been there. The forest seemed peaceful again, almost as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I packed a small bag of essentials, determined to move further along the trail that day, but I left a portion of my supplies in the cabin, hoping that the sense of safety the structure offered would not vanish entirely. The following days were tense, even as the forest returned to a quiet routine. Birds called in the distance, The wind rustled through the branches, and small animals scuttled across the trail. But I kept thinking about that night. I kept imagining someone, or something, watching me from just beyond the trees, waiting for me to let my guard down. I slept lightly, always ready, knife close, water near, backpack packed. On the third day, the real test came. I was refilling my water from a stream about half a mile from the cabin when I heard it. Voices, low and muffled, but unmistakably human. My stomach sank. I froze, scanning the trees, trying to see anything through the mist. Then I saw movement. Figures moving slowly along the trail I had been following. I ducked behind a fallen log and watched. There were two of them, dressed in heavy coats, backpacks slung over their shoulders. They didn't see me, but they passed the cabin and continued down the trail. They didn't appear to be looking for me specifically, but the idea of someone else so close made my anxiety spike. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my remaining items, making sure not to leave anything behind that could indicate I had been there, and started along the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches brushing against my arms, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I kept moving, making deliberate, careful progress, all the while aware of the sound of the forest behind me. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind through the trees made my pulse spike. By evening, I had reached a small clearing, and from there I could see the valley below. A road, barely visible through the trees, wound its way toward civilization. I pushed on, fatigue heavy in my legs, but adrenaline lending me the strength to keep moving. I did not stop until I reached the edge of the forest and the first faint signs of cars and human habitation. There were a few houses, a faint hum of electricity, and the smell of smoke from chimneys. Civilization felt surreal after days of isolation. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over me, almost dizzying in its intensity. I did not return to the cabin. I left it behind, hidden among the trees, as if it had never existed. But I carried the memory of that night with me. The scratches at the door, the feeling of being watched, the tension that had never fully eased. I understood, in a very real way, the danger of isolation, the power of fear when it is grounded in real human possibilities. Weeks later, back home, I looked at maps again, trying to place the cabin, trying to understand if it was truly abandoned or if someone had been there before me. I never found it, and I never tried to, but I remembered it vividly. The smell of damp wood, the creaking floorboards, the way the wind whispered through the cracks, and the understanding that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or myths, but the unknown presence of other humans, silent and unseen. I kept my knife within reach for months after that. I still hike alone sometimes, but I choose my trails carefully, always aware of how easy it is for someone else to hide in the trees, waiting. And I always remember the cabin, the one place I found myself completely alone and completely aware that I might not be alone at all. That memory is sharper than fear itself because it is real, and it reminds me that even in the wilderness, even when you think you are safe, you are never entirely in control. I never felt haunted by the cabin, not in the way people talk about being haunted. I felt something stronger, a deep, enduring respect for isolation, for the forest, and for the unseen human presence that could exist anywhere. I learned to move quietly, to trust my instincts, and to accept that fear is not something to be conquered, but something to understand and navigate. The cabin remains in my memory as a landmark, a warning, a testament to the thin line between solitude and vulnerability. And every time I plan a new trip into the wilderness, I think about it, about the sound of those scratches, about the subtle feeling that I had been watched, and about the importance of never underestimating the reality of being completely alone with other humans in the same space. I never returned, and I never needed to. The forest, the trail, the cabin, all of it remains etched in my memory. But I survived. I learned, and I became more careful, more aware, and far more respectful of the wilderness and of the people who move through it unseen. That was the only ending I needed. Clear, real, and completely grounded in the reality of what had happened. No magic, no myths, only the sharp, unflinching truth of being alone in a place where you might not be alone at all. That evening, I decided to take precautions. I gathered all the firewood I could find and stacked it inside, set the stove to burn hot, and barricaded the door as best as I could. I checked the windows repeatedly, and when I lay down that night, I left the flashlight within reach. The rain had stopped, but the forest was now quiet in a way that felt unnatural. There was no wind, no movement, no sound other than the faint hum of the creek. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but every shadow seemed to twist and move. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the trees, pale against the dark trunks, but when I shined the light, it was gone. Sleep came fitfully, in brief moments between shivers and the need to check the locks. On the third day, I realized that supplies were limited. I had brought only enough food for a week, thinking I would spend 2 or 3 nights at most. The isolation, combined with the fear, made everything harder. My mind kept going back to the footprints, to the sense that someone had been near the cabin. I began to notice subtle signs. A branch broken close to the cabin, footprints that weren't there before, the faint sound of movement outside at night. I started to document everything, taking notes, marking the time and direction of each sound or sighting. I told myself it was paranoia, but I could not deny that something, or someone, was paying attention. I began carrying the axe at all times, sleeping with it close, keeping the fire burning constantly. Every noise made my heart race. A twig snapping, the creek rushing louder for a moment, the wind rustling through leaves. I felt trapped in a cage of my own making, unable to leave, unable to fully relax. It was on the 4th night that the real fear set in. I was woken by the sound of movement outside, heavier this time, deliberate. I grabbed the axe and moved to the window. The beam of the flashlight caught a figure moving between the trees. Human, tall, slow. I froze, heart in my throat, watching it move along the edge of the cabin. It stopped, as if listening, and then disappeared back into the forest. I realized I had underestimated the situation. This was not an animal. This was a person. I barricaded the door more thoroughly, stacking furniture against it and covering the windows with blankets to prevent anyone from seeing in. I did not sleep that night. I sat, watching, listening, waiting for any sound. When the sun rose, I ventured outside cautiously. The ground was soft from the rain, and I could see footprints leading toward the cabin and away again. They were large, heavy, and unmistakably human. Someone had been here while I slept. The realization hit me hard. I was alone, far from anyone who could help, and someone had been tracking me. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I stocked the stove, gathered food, mapped the surrounding terrain, and scouted a route to the nearest road. The person outside had not returned during daylight, but the knowledge that they had been there lingered. I packed my bag carefully, leaving the cabin cleaner than I had found it, leaving no trace of valuables, and set out at dawn on the 5th day. I followed the faint path I had taken in, keeping close to the edge of the forest, listening for sounds. The forest seemed quieter than before, oppressive in its silence. The road appeared eventually, slick with rain, and I hurried along it, glancing over my shoulder constantly. When I finally saw the first car, a local pickup truck heading down the mountain, relief washed over me. I ran to the road and waved, heart racing, mud caking my clothes, and the driver stopped. I told them my situation, and they nodded, calling the authorities for me. The cabin was never the same after that. Even though I returned later with police, there was no trace of the person who had been watching. It was a stark reminder of how fragile safety can be, how isolation can hide dangers that civilization usually protects against. I learned a lot from that experience. To prepare for isolation carefully, to trust instincts, and to never underestimate the presence of another person when alone in the wild. I now view the mountains differently. Beauty is still there, but so is caution, and I carry both with me. The memory of that cabin, the dark nights, the rain, the footprints in the mud, remains vivid, a scar of experience and survival. I had been driving for hours through the narrow, twisting roads that wound their way deep into the mountains. The sky was a dull gray, and rain had started falling in a fine, persistent drizzle that made the windshield streak like silver threads. I wasn't sure why I had decided to come here alone to this cabin I had rented online. I had been desperate for solitude, for a break from the constant noise and pressure of the city, and the listing promised peace and isolation. The pictures had shown a small, wooden cabin tucked into the trees, with a creek nearby and no other buildings in sight. In my mind, it sounded perfect. Now, driving through a forest that was thick and dark even in the daytime, I started to question the wisdom of it. The GPS signal was weak, flickering in and out like a dying light, and every curve in the road seemed narrower than the last. I passed abandoned trucks and signs warning of landslides, and the weight of the isolation began to press against me. The cabin itself looked exactly as it had in the photos. A small, squat building made of weathered logs, with a pitched roof covered in moss and a stone chimney. A rickety wooden porch ran along the front, and the door had a simple iron latch. As I parked my car on the muddy incline leading to the cabin, I noticed how silent it was, too silent. There was the sound of rain on the leaves and water trickling down the hillside, but no birds, no wind in the trees, no distant hum of traffic. It was a silence that felt like a pause in the world, a holding of breath. I carried my bag inside, setting it down on the floor of the small living space. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and mold, and dust covered the shelves like a thin layer of frost. There was a stove, a small table, a few chairs, and a couch that sagged in the middle. The windows were thick with grime, but I could make out the outline of trees pressed closely against the walls, the forest pressing in as if to keep me inside. I unpacked a few supplies and lit the stove, warming my hands over the fire as the rain continued to fall. Outside, the creek babbled faintly, a sound that would normally be soothing, but here it seemed sharper, more intrusive. As night fell, the cabin became darker than I had expected. The rain had thickened to a steady downpour, and the windows now framed a wall of water. I ate a simple meal of canned beans warmed on the stove, feeling the heat from the fire against the chill that had settled into my bones. As I moved about the cabin, arranging my things and checking the windows and doors, I became aware of a feeling I hadn't expected, the sense of being watched. At first, I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the place. But it persisted, a prickling tension at the back of my neck. I had brought a flashlight, and before going to bed, I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, shining the light into the thick brush and trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and undergrowth, but nothing else. No animals, no people, no movement at all except for the rain falling in streaks. I returned inside, locking the door, and tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I set the stove to low, just enough to keep the cabin from becoming cold, and lay down on the sagging couch, pulling a blanket over me. The darkness pressed against the windows, and the rain tapped out a steady rhythm that was almost hypnotic. My eyelids grew heavy, and soon I was asleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a noise. At first I thought it was the wind, a branch scraping against the roof, but the sound repeated, slow and deliberate. A thump, followed by another. I froze, straining my ears over the hum of the storm. It was coming from outside, near the side of the cabin. I sat up, listening, heart thudding in my chest. Another thump, something heavy, moving, though I could not see it through the thick darkness and rain. I grabbed the flashlight and stood, slowly moving to the window. The beam fell on the ground outside, illuminating the wet earth and the low bushes. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched had grown sharper, and I noticed, for the first time, footprints. They were faint in the mud, large, and they led toward the cabin from the woods. There was no pattern, no regularity, but the prints were there. I moved closer, pressing my forehead to the glass, tracing them with the flashlight. The rain was washing them away quickly, but it was enough to confirm. Someone or something had been here. Panic began to rise in me, a slow burn of adrenaline. I checked the door, making sure it was latched, and grabbed the small axe I had brought for firewood. It was a poor defense, but it was all I had. The storm outside had grown louder, wind rattling the trees, rain hammering the roof. I tried to reason with myself. There was no road for anyone to have come down to the cabin in this weather. Maybe it was an animal, a bear or a deer, but the footprints, they were too large, too human. I moved to the other windows, peering out, shining the beam of the flashlight across the yard and into the trees. For hours I watched, sitting in the corner, exhausted and terrified, but nothing returned. When the sky began to lighten slightly, gray giving way to dull white, I finally let myself relax a little. Sleep had been impossible, but at least the worst of the night seemed over. Morning brought no relief. The footprints were gone, erased by the rain, and I could see the road leading to the cabin still slick and empty. I left the door locked and set out along the small path I had driven in on, intending to see if there was anyone nearby, any signs of civilization. The forest was thick and wet, the air heavy with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. Every sound, water dripping, a branch breaking, made me jump. The feeling of being followed never left me. Hours passed as I explored the area around the cabin, noting streams, fallen logs, and the slope of the hill. There was no one, no sign of human presence other than the road I had driven in on. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I grabbed a flashlight, some water, and the lamp and moved to the fireplace. I tested the opening. It was narrow, just wide enough for a small adult to climb. I could hear faint footsteps circling the cabin now, slower, as if the person was looking for an entrance. My hands shook as I climbed into the fireplace. The stone was cold against my skin, and I had to squeeze my shoulders through, but I made it in. Once inside, I crouched, trying to make myself as small as possible. The darkness swallowed me, and I held my breath, listening. Minutes passed. The footsteps moved away, then returned, closer now, circling again. I could hear the person's breathing, heavy, slow, methodical. They paused near the back door, jiggled the handle slightly, then moved to the front. I realized they were searching, trying to find a way in. My mind raced with possible actions, but I knew one wrong move could expose me. I stayed still, silent, and tried to control my fear. The person stayed outside for what felt like an eternity. Then finally, I heard the crunch of gravel as they walked back toward the woods. I didn't move for another hour, waiting until I was certain they had gone. When I finally climbed out, the cabin was still, silent. The night had returned to its natural sounds. The wind, the stream, the distant cries of animals. I checked the perimeter. There was no one, no footprints beyond the gravel path. The clearing was empty. I realized then that it could have been anyone. Someone lost, someone casing the cabin, someone with bad intentions. The thought made me uneasy, but relief also washed over me. I locked all the doors and windows, secured everything, and sat by the fireplace until dawn, unable to sleep. The morning came slowly. Light filtered through the trees, and the forest seemed peaceful again, almost normal. I had survived the night, unharmed, and I felt a cautious sense of triumph. I decided to leave the cabin. I packed quickly, loaded the car, and checked the property one last time. Everything was intact, and the forest seemed calm. I drove back down the dirt road, gravel crunching under the tires, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. When I reached the town, I called the police and reported the incident. They told me they would send a patrol, but it was unlikely they would find anyone after the fact. The experience stayed with me for weeks. Every time I heard a noise in the dark, my heart jumped. But I also learned something about myself, the ability to stay calm, to plan, to survive under pressure. It changed the way I approached isolation and safety. I still loved the woods, still wanted quiet, but I realized that solitude came with risks. Being prepared, being aware, and respecting that danger made the difference between fear and survival. Eventually, the fear faded, replaced by memory and caution. I never returned to that cabin, but I often thought of it. The way the forest looked in the light, the smell of pine, the sound of the stream. And I remembered that night, the terror, the steps outside, and the relief of seeing daylight again. It became a lesson, a story of survival, grounded in reality, and the kind of fear that teaches you to respect the world, not the supernatural. I had planned the trip for months. I needed a break from everything. Work, people, the constant noise of the city, and I found a small cabin tucked deep in the mountains that I could rent for a week. It wasn't far from the road, but it felt isolated enough that I could actually breathe. I had packed everything I thought I would need: food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, blankets, and firewood. I even brought a small toolkit just in case. The map said the cabin was about 3 miles from the nearest main road, along a narrow dirt path that wound between thick trees and a few rocky clearings. When I arrived, the sun was already low in the sky, brushing the tops of the pine trees with a golden light. The cabin looked small and weathered, made of dark wood with a steep roof and a small porch. It had no electricity or running water, but a hand pump for water was attached near the side of the building, and the fireplace looked like it had been used recently. A small pile of firewood was stacked neatly next to the cabin. I parked my car nearby and took a long breath, letting the crisp mountain air fill my lungs. The smell of pine and damp earth was sharp, clean, and almost intoxicating after weeks in the city. I spent the first hour unpacking and organizing the cabin. I arranged the food and supplies, stacked more firewood near the fireplace, and checked the windows and door locks. The cabin felt secure, but the deeper I looked into the surrounding forest, the more I realized how alone I truly was. It wasn't the kind of isolation that made you think about ghosts or monsters. It was the real kind, the one where if something went wrong, help might be hours away. That thought made me careful, and I liked that. As evening fell, I decided to start a fire. I gathered kindling from the small pile of wood, arranged it carefully, and struck a match. The first flame sputtered, almost went out, then caught and grew steady. Soon, the fire was warm, steady, and crackling. I sat near it, eating a simple meal of canned beans and bread, listening to the woods around me. At first, there was only the sound of wind through the trees, the occasional bird, or the scuttle of some small animal. But then I began noticing other sounds. Branches snapping farther away, the rustle of leaves that didn't seem connected to the wind, a low, distant thump that I couldn't identify. I tried to rationalize it. Deer, maybe a bear far off, some other animal moving through the underbrush. The thought made me feel slightly safer, but it also made me more alert. I checked my flashlight and kept it nearby, just in case. The cabin felt solid, the door locked tight, and the windows were closed. I convinced myself I was safe. Night came fully, and the darkness outside the cabin pressed close. I could see nothing beyond a few feet of the clearing around the cabin. Every little sound seemed amplified. The crack of a branch, the rustle of a bush, the whisper of wind through the pines. I poured myself a small cup of water and sat near the fire, keeping it alive, telling myself that the isolation was part of the experience. It was peaceful in a way that city life never could be. Around midnight, I woke to a faint noise. First, I thought it was my imagination, a slow, dragging sound from somewhere outside the cabin. I froze, listening. Came again, deliberate, slow, like someone dragging something over rocks. My heart began to race. I checked the locks on the doors again, then the windows. Everything was secure. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady to be a deer or a bear moving naturally. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the small porch to look around. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing, the piles of firewood, and the rough dirt path leading into the forest. There was nothing. I scanned the trees, the underbrush, the rocks. Nothing moved, nothing was out of place. And yet, I could still hear it. A soft, dragging noise coming from the side of the cabin, somewhere beyond the firelight. I went back inside and sat as close to the door as I could without being outside. I kept the flashlight in my hand and the fire burning. The noise didn't come closer, it didn't get louder, but it persisted, a slow, methodical dragging that went on and on. I tried to sleep, telling myself that I must have been imagining it, that it was just branches and animals. But every time I drifted off, I would wake up to the sound again. By early morning, I was exhausted. The sun was beginning to rise, filtering weakly through the trees. I needed to see what had been causing the noise. I grabbed my boots, my flashlight, and a small hatchet I kept near the fire. Outside, the forest was calm and silent. I followed the sound from the previous night along the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw it, tracks. Large, booted tracks, not animal footprints, dragging something heavy across the dirt path. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could see the grooves where something rough had scraped along the dirt. I had been driving for hours through the narrow, twisting roads that wound their way deep into the mountains. The sky was a dull gray, and rain had started falling in a fine, persistent drizzle that made the windshield streak like silver threads. I wasn't sure why I had decided to come here alone to this cabin I had rented online. I had been desperate for solitude, for a break from the constant noise and pressure of the city, and the listing promised peace and isolation. The pictures had shown a small, wooden cabin tucked into the trees, with a creek nearby and no other buildings in sight. In my mind, it sounded perfect. Now, driving through a forest that was thick and dark even in the daytime, I started to question the wisdom of it. The GPS signal was weak, flickering in and out like a dying light, and every curve in the road seemed narrower than the last. I passed abandoned trucks and signs warning of landslides, and the weight of the isolation began to press against me. The cabin itself looked exactly as it had in the photos. A small, squat building made of weathered logs, with a pitched roof covered in moss and a stone chimney. A rickety wooden porch ran along the front, and the door had a simple iron latch. As I parked my car on the muddy incline leading to the cabin, I noticed how silent it was, too silent. There was the sound of rain on the leaves and water trickling down the hillside, but no birds, no wind in the trees, no distant hum of traffic. It was a silence that felt like a pause in the world, a holding of breath. I carried my bag inside, setting it down on the floor of the small living space. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and mold, and dust covered the shelves like a thin layer of frost. There was a stove, a small table, a few chairs, and a couch that sagged in the middle. The windows were thick with grime, but I could make out the outline of trees pressed closely against the walls, the forest pressing in as if to keep me inside. I unpacked a few supplies and lit the stove, warming my hands over the fire as the rain continued to fall. Outside, the creek babbled faintly, a sound that would normally be soothing, but here it seemed sharper, more intrusive. As night fell, the cabin became darker than I had expected. The rain had thickened to a steady downpour, and the windows now framed a wall of water. I ate a simple meal of canned beans warmed on the stove, feeling the heat from the fire against the chill that had settled into my bones. As I moved about the cabin, arranging my things and checking the windows and doors, I became aware of a feeling I hadn't expected, the sense of being watched. At first, I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the place. But it persisted, a prickling tension at the back of my neck. I had brought a flashlight, and before going to bed, I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, shining the light into the thick brush and trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and undergrowth, but nothing else. No animals, no people, no movement at all except for the rain falling in streaks. I returned inside, locking the door, and tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I set the stove to low, just enough to keep the cabin from becoming cold, and lay down on the sagging couch, pulling a blanket over me. The darkness pressed against the windows, and the rain tapped out a steady rhythm that was almost hypnotic. My eyelids grew heavy, and soon I was asleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a noise. At first I thought it was the wind, a branch scraping against the roof, but the sound repeated, slow and deliberate. A thump, followed by another. I froze, straining my ears over the hum of the storm. It was coming from outside, near the side of the cabin. I sat up, listening, heart thudding in my chest. Another thump, something heavy, moving, though I could not see it through the thick darkness and rain. I grabbed the flashlight and stood, slowly moving to the window. The beam fell on the ground outside, illuminating the wet earth and the low bushes. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched had grown sharper, and I noticed, for the first time, footprints. They were faint in the mud, large, and they led toward the cabin from the woods. There was no pattern, no regularity, but the prints were there. I moved closer, pressing my forehead to the glass, tracing them with the flashlight. The rain was washing them away quickly, but it was enough to confirm. Someone or something had been here. Panic began to rise in me, a slow burn of adrenaline. I checked the door, making sure it was latched, and grabbed the small axe I had brought for firewood. It was a poor defense, but it was all I had. The storm outside had grown louder, wind rattling the trees, rain hammering the roof. I tried to reason with myself. There was no road for anyone to have come down to the cabin in this weather. Maybe it was an animal, a bear or a deer, but the footprints, they were too large, too human. I moved to the other windows, peering out, shining the beam of the flashlight across the yard and into the trees. For hours I watched, sitting in the corner, exhausted and terrified, but nothing returned. When the sky began to lighten slightly, gray giving way to dull white, I finally let myself relax a little. Sleep had been impossible, but at least the worst of the night seemed over. Morning brought no relief. The footprints were gone, erased by the rain, and I could see the road leading to the cabin still slick and empty. I left the door locked and set out along the small path I had driven in on, intending to see if there was anyone nearby, any signs of civilization. The forest was thick and wet, the air heavy with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. Every sound, water dripping, a branch breaking, made me jump. The feeling of being followed never left me. Hours passed as I explored the area around the cabin, noting streams, fallen logs, and the slope of the hill. There was no one, no sign of human presence other than the road I had driven in on. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that something had been watching me. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. Life in the city was exhausting, the noise, the people, the constant rush, and I needed a break. I wanted silence, isolation, and something that would let me forget everything for a while. That's why I rented a small cabin in the woods. It was far from the nearest town, deep enough that the cell signal would be weak, almost non-existent, but close enough that I could reach the road in an hour if I had to. The pictures online made it look perfect, wooden, rustic, with a stone fireplace and a small porch that overlooked a stream. It seemed like the kind of place where time slowed down and worries faded away. I arrived in the late afternoon. The forest was dense, full of tall pines and oaks that blocked the sun in strange patterns. The drive had been long and nerve-wracking. Gravel roads turned into dirt trails, and every so often I would have to stop and check the map because the GPS signal disappeared completely. But when I finally reached the cabin, I felt relief wash over me. The place was even better than the photos suggested. I parked the car and stepped onto the porch. The smell of pine mixed with damp earth filled my nose. I could hear the stream trickling nearby, the wind whispering through the trees, and nothing else. No cars, no planes, no city sounds. Just the quiet of the forest. I spent the first hour walking around the property, taking it all in. There was a small clearing behind the cabin, and beyond that, the woods stretched on endlessly. I noticed old deer tracks near the stream, and I thought about how quiet it must be for wildlife here. The cabin itself had everything I needed. Inside, the wooden floors creaked under my feet. There was a small kitchen, a living area with the fireplace and 2 bedrooms. One room had a bed, the other had a cot and some storage shelves. Everything was simple but functional. I unpacked my bag, laid out my clothes, and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth and smell of burning would made the cabin feel homey, almost comforting. By the time night fell, the forest had changed completely. The sky darkened to a deep black, and the stars were visible, countless and bright, more than I had ever seen from the city. The stream reflected the light faintly, and every sound seemed louder. The crackling of the fire, the wind rustling the leaves, the occasional distant snap of a branch. I sat on the porch for a long time, staring into the darkness, feeling a mix of calm and unease. It was the kind of silence that made you notice things you normally wouldn't. The distant howl of a coyote sent a chill down my spine, and I realized how small and exposed I was out here, surrounded by trees and shadows. I went inside eventually, shutting the door and locking it. The cabin was quiet and safe, or so I thought. I ate a simple dinner, a can of soup heated on the stove, and then read a little by the fire. My mind was relaxed, but still aware of the isolation. As I got ready for bed, I double-checked the locks. The cabin had old, sturdy locks, but the thought of someone, or something, coming up the driveway made my stomach tighten. I shook it off, reminding myself I was being silly. There wasn't anyone out here for miles. I turned off the lights and lay in bed, listening to the forest. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the cabin. But then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate sound, like footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. I froze, trying to make sense of it. The sound was slow, measured, and it seemed to move around the perimeter of the cabin. My heart started racing. I told myself it could be an animal, a raccoon, maybe a deer, but the rhythm of the steps felt human. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and quietly tiptoed to the window. The beam of the flashlight swept across the porch and the clearing beyond, but there was nothing. I could see the moonlight reflecting off the stream, the shadows of the trees, but no sign of anyone. Still, the steps continued, faint now, but moving closer to the back of the cabin. I stayed by the window for what felt like hours, trying to listen. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. My first instinct was to call the police, but my phone showed no signal. I was completely isolated. The idea of confronting someone outside terrified me. I considered hiding in the bedroom and waiting until morning, but part of me wanted to understand what was happening. I finally decided to check the back door, the one facing the clearing. I picked up a heavy metal lamp from the fireplace mantel, a small but solid object to defend myself if needed. The handle was cold in my hand, but it gave me some sense of control. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking, and shone the flashlight across the clearing. The night was empty. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, nothing. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. I lowered the flashlight and leaned against the doorframe, my body tense. Then I heard it again, a snap close behind me. I spun around, swinging the light toward the edge of the forest. There, in the shadows, a figure emerged. At first, I couldn't see clearly. It was dark, blending into the trees, but I could make out the outline of a person, tall and still, watching me. I froze. The person didn't move, didn't call out, just stared. My mind raced. Was it someone lost? Someone dangerous? My chest tightened, and I gripped the lamp harder. I backed into the cabin and slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could. My heart was pounding in my ears. I realized I was trapped, alone, with no signal and someone outside. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally. Who would come out here at this hour? What would they want? I considered hiding in the bedroom, but I needed a plan. I knew the police could take hours to reach me, and I wasn't sure if this person was alone. I started moving quietly through the cabin, thinking of escape routes. The front door was far, and it would be obvious if I ran. The windows were the same, they offered no real protection. Then I remembered the fireplace. There was a chimney, and though it was a tight squeeze, it could be a temporary refuge. It wasn't ideal, but it might buy me some time. The night passed slowly. I barely slept, listening to every sound, hearing every leaf fall. At dawn, I felt exhausted but relieved that the night had passed without the door being broken. I decided to hike further that morning, needing to clear my head. I followed the creek upstream for about 2 hours. The forest was beautiful, serene, and peaceful in the daylight. I almost forgot the fear from the previous night. Almost. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The woodpile by the door had been disturbed. Logs were slightly shifted, as if someone or something had been there. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen anyone around. No tracks other than animal tracks. I checked the perimeter, looking for any signs of humans. None. The idea that someone could have been near the cabin at night, watching me, made my skin crawl. That evening, I stayed alert. I made sure the stove was burning, the doors and windows were locked, and I kept my phone close. Night fell slowly, the forest darkening around me. The sounds started again, scratching, movement near the windows. I stayed in the loft, watching the shadows. Hours passed. The fear was oppressive, making it hard to think. Around midnight, I heard something different. Soft, careful footsteps approaching the cabin. Not the heavy thump of an animal, but light, deliberate. My pulse shot up. I stayed silent, holding my knife, listening. The steps circled the cabin slowly. I realized with a cold shock that it wasn't an animal. Someone had been outside. Someone had been watching me. I sat in the loft, frozen, every nerve on edge. The footsteps receded after a while, moving into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I packed quickly, deciding I couldn't stay another night. I walked to my car, constantly scanning the forest. I noticed more signs. Flattened grass near the trail, broken branches. Someone had been following me during my hike the previous day. I felt both terrified and foolish for not realizing it sooner. As I drove back, I called the local ranger station to report what had happened. They took my statement seriously, noting that the area had seen a few incidents of people breaking into cabins or trespassing in the past months. They advised me to leave immediately and never return alone. I promised I wouldn't. Once back in the city, I felt the relief of normal life, but the memory of the cabin stayed with me for weeks. The isolation, the sounds, the knowledge that someone had been watching me, waiting. I realized how vulnerable I had been. I never went back to a remote cabin alone after that. I learned to respect solitude, but also to respect the fact that people sometimes use the wilderness as cover to stalk, to watch, to invade. In the end, I understood the importance of preparation, of never underestimating danger. I documented every detail of my experience, down to the time the noises started, the way the woodpile had been disturbed, the feeling of the footsteps circling the cabin. I shared it online in a survival forum, warning others who might seek solitude in remote cabins. I didn't want anyone else to make the same mistake I had. I kept the experience with me as a lesson. Fear isn't always something supernatural. Sometimes it's very real, very human, and the kind you can't ignore. And sometimes the only way to survive it is to trust your instincts, respect the reality of the world around you, and never assume that isolation is safe. The cabin is still there, probably rented to someone else now. I never returned, but the memory of that night, the darkness, the sounds, the eyes watching from the trees, remains. It reminds me that the forest isn't just beautiful. It's alive, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous in ways you can't foresee. I survived because I acted, because I left in time, and because I learned that fear, as real as it is, can be the best tool for survival if you respect it. I had planned this trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything, leave the city behind, and be alone in the woods for a while. I found a small cabin for rent through a local website, tucked deep in a forested area several miles outside the nearest town. The photos looked perfect. A rustic wooden cabin with a stone chimney, a small porch, and a clear view of a lake in the distance. There was no electricity advertised, just a wood stove and some solar-powered lights. I liked that. I needed silence, and I wanted to be completely off the grid. I packed my car carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies to last the week. I brought a gas canister for the stove, a battery-powered lantern, and a thick notebook to write in. I also packed a basic first aid kit, just in case. The drive there was long. The first hour was fine, just winding roads through low hills and farmland. Then the trees started to close in, and the road narrowed to a single lane. At one point, a fallen tree forced me to back up for half a mile until I could find a side path. My phone had already lost signal an hour ago, so I couldn't check GPS. I had downloaded an offline map just in case, and I followed it carefully, trying not to make a wrong turn. Every mile deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller and denser. The road became more like a trail with potholes and rocks, and I had to drive slowly to avoid damaging the car. By the time I finally saw the cabin, I was relieved. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest. The lake wasn't visible yet, but I could smell the water and hear the faint sound of birds and insects. The cabin was even smaller than the photos, but it looked sturdy. A thin plume of smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. The porch was covered in fallen leaves, and the wooden steps creaked under my weight as I approached. The door was unlocked, just as the owner had said in the email. I stepped inside, and the smell of wood and damp earth hit me immediately. The interior was simple. One room with a small kitchen area, a sleeping loft above, and the wood stove in the corner. I spent the first few hours unpacking and organizing. I stacked firewood neatly beside the stove and set up my lanterns around the cabin. I checked the windows to make sure they were secure. Outside, the sky had started to darken, and a cool breeze moved through the trees. I decided to make a small fire in the stove and cook my dinner. I had brought pasta and canned sauce, which I heated carefully. The cabin began to feel more like home as the warmth spread from the stove. I ate slowly, listening to the creaks of the wood and the distant sounds of the forest. Night came quickly. I had expected it, but the darkness here was different. In the city, even at night, there is always light somewhere, always sound. Here, the darkness seemed thick, almost solid. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the only light came from the stove and my small lantern. I decided to explore the area outside before it got too late. I stepped out onto the porch, taking a careful look around. The forest seemed to stretch forever in every direction. The air was damp and smelled of earth and pine. I could hear running water nearby, probably from the lake or a small stream. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, but I couldn't tell if it was an animal or just the wind. I stood still for a few minutes, straining my eyes. I wanted to see the lake, but it was too dark. Back inside, I cleaned up and prepared for the night. I kept the fire going and set my lanterns so that I could move around the cabin without needing the stove. I checked my supplies again, making sure nothing was missing or out of place. I felt a small, quiet sense of relief. I was alone, exactly where I wanted to be. But even as I tried to focus on the peace of it, I couldn't ignore the unease creeping into the edges of my mind. The forest outside felt alive in a way I wasn't used to. The sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, were louder than I expected. Every sound seemed to have a meaning, though I couldn't understand what. The first night was restless. I woke several times to strange noises outside. Once, I thought I heard footsteps near the porch, slow and deliberate. I froze, straining to listen. Nothing followed. The sound could have been an animal, a branch falling, or the wind. I told myself that, but I still couldn't sleep properly. Morning came slowly. The sun filtered through the trees, creating streaks of light across the cabin floor. I made coffee on the stove and sat by the window, watching the forest wake. Birds flew from branch to branch, and small animals scurried through the underbrush. I tried to shake off the fear from the night before, but it lingered like a shadow. The next day, I decided to explore the lake. I had a small path leading through the trees, marked faintly by worn stones and footprints. I followed it carefully, moving slowly over roots and rocks. The forest was dense, and the undergrowth thick, but I felt a strange satisfaction at moving through it. After about 20 minutes, I broke through to a small clearing, and the lake was there. The water was calm, reflecting the gray sky above. I walked along the shore, noticing the footprints of deer and other small animals. The air smelled of wet earth and algae. I spent some time taking photographs and collecting small stones along the edge, just to have something to show for the effort. By mid-afternoon, I was back at the cabin. I started preparing a bigger fire in the stove. The wood was damp from the morning dew, so it took some effort to get it burning. I stacked the logs carefully, arranging them so that the fire would last for several hours. The sound of the flames crackling and the smell of burning would make me feel more secure, as though the fire was a protective barrier against the vast, dark forest outside. I spent the evening writing in my notebook, trying to capture the details of the forest and the lake, and also trying to process the unease I felt. There was nothing supernatural, nothing unexplainable, but the isolation was getting to me. I had planned this trip for months. The idea of leaving the city behind, of cutting myself off from the endless noise, traffic, and people had been intoxicating. I wanted peace, the kind that only came with isolation, the kind you could feel in your bones. The cabin was small, wooden, and tucked deep in the forest near a lake that few people ever visited. I had found it online, and it seemed perfect. The pictures showed a weathered but sturdy structure, surrounded by dense pine trees. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, reflecting the green of the forest. It looked like paradise. I arrived in the early afternoon, driving my small SUV along the narrow, winding dirt roads that led deeper into the forest. The GPS worked intermittently, and soon I was navigating by memory and landmarks alone. The road was overgrown in places, pine needles covering sections of gravel, the occasional fallen branch forcing me to swerve. I felt a thrill as I drove, a mix of excitement and unease. I had been alone in the wilderness before, but never this far. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a small surge of relief. It was exactly as I had imagined, with moss creeping along the roof edges and weathered wooden walls that seemed as old as the forest itself. The front porch sagged slightly, but it looked solid enough. I parked the SUV in a small clearing, the tires crunching over dry leaves and twigs. The forest seemed to press in on all sides, tall pines and firs forming a natural wall, and I realized how silent it was. Not a bird chirped, not even the wind stirred the needles. The quiet was so heavy it felt almost like a physical weight. I unloaded my bag, a large backpack with my supplies: food, water, a first aid kit, flashlight, spare batteries, and a small toolkit. I had a small generator and a solar panel for electricity, but I mostly relied on battery-powered lights. The cabin had a small fireplace, and I had brought a few logs as well. Everything seemed perfect, exactly what I needed to disappear from the world for a few days. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and dust. There were a few pieces of old furniture: a table, a couple of chairs, and a narrow bed. The windows were thick glass, but some were smudged with dirt, giving the room a slightly dim, muted light. I set up my things, arranging food and water in the small kitchen area, checking that my flashlight and batteries worked, and testing the small generator. Everything functioned as it should. I stepped outside again to enjoy the view of the lake. The water was calm, almost unnaturally still, reflecting the forest like a dark mirror. A thin mist hovered above it, though the sun was high and the air warm. It was beautiful and serene, but I had a creeping feeling, a small flicker in my gut, that made me uneasy. The first night passed quietly. I lit a fire in the fireplace, ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread, and settled into the bed early. The forest around me was dark, and I could hear faint rustlings in the distance. Small animals, I told myself, but every time a branch snapped or a shadow moved, I felt my heart jump. I tried to convince myself it was all normal. The wind moved through the trees, squirrels or raccoons searched for food. Maybe a deer passed by. The next morning I woke early. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and I felt more relaxed. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, but the ground was dry and firm underfoot. I walked carefully, making mental notes of landmarks in case I wandered too far. After a while, I reached the edge of the lake. The water was colder than I expected, clear and still. I decided to take a small swim, careful of the slippery rocks along the shore. The cold shock of the water was invigorating, and I spent some time walking along the edge, skipping stones, listening to the occasional plop as they sank. By midday, I returned to the cabin. I made another small fire, cooked some food, and sat watching the lake. The quiet was comforting, but also unsettling. Hours passed, and the shadows lengthened. I noticed a faint trail of footprints in the mud near the lake. At first, I thought they were deer, but the spacing was odd, almost human. My chest tightened as I examined them. They were large, heavy, and not quite like any human shoe prints I recognized. I snapped a few photos for reference, unsure what to do. I felt a sudden surge of caution. That night, I went to bed earlier, double-checking the locks on doors and windows. I kept my flashlight within arm's reach. Around midnight, I woke to a soft noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it continued. A faint scraping, like someone dragging a foot over gravel or fallen twigs. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped suddenly. My mind raced. There was no one else here, I told myself. The cabin was deep in the forest. Could it be an animal? Possibly a bear or a large raccoon. I checked my small hunting knife, the only tool I had for protection. The next morning, I found something alarming. The back door of the cabin, which I was certain I had locked, was slightly ajar. I didn't see any signs of forced entry, but the latch was bent. Panic set in. I spent the morning examining the cabin, checking every door, window, and lock. Nothing seemed missing, but the feeling of being watched was intense. I began to consider leaving, but the nearest town was over an hour away on rough, narrow roads. My phone had no signal. I was isolated. Over the next 2 days, I noticed more signs that I wasn't alone. Small items I had left on the table were slightly moved, though no one had touched them. Footprints near the cabin were more pronounced now, always disappearing into the trees. Once, I saw a shadow moving past the window while I was inside, but when I went to check, there was nothing. I started keeping the fire burning constantly, leaving the flashlight on at all times. I felt like a trapped animal, watching for predators that might never appear. By the 4th day, my fear had escalated. I was exhausted, unable to sleep properly, and hyper-alert at all times. Every noise made me jump. I avoided going far from the cabin, walking the perimeter carefully, sometimes hiding behind trees to scan the forest. I knew that fear could make me imagine things, but some instincts are primal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. That evening, I decided to secure the cabin further. I used heavy furniture to block doors, set small traps around the perimeter with sticks and rocks to alert me to movement, and fashioned a makeshift weapon from an old metal rod I found in the shed. I checked every window and door 3 times. I lit a large fire in the fireplace, the flames casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. I sat near it, every muscle tense, waiting. Around midnight, the noise returned. Scraping, shifting, subtle and deliberate, came from the side of the cabin. I held my breath, clutching the metal rod, listening. The noise moved slowly around the cabin, circling, as if someone was inspecting it. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, soft but unmistakable. I forced myself to remain silent, imagining what I would do if someone tried to enter. I realized that the intruder might not be human, but even if it were, the isolation meant I couldn't rely on anyone. I was utterly alone. Then I heard something I hadn't anticipated. A low, rumbling growl came from the edge of the forest, deep in the shadows. My stomach twisted. Bears inhabited this area, and the tracks I had seen earlier might have belonged to one. But the sounds were deliberate, almost intelligent, like the creature was observing me. My heart pounded. I felt trapped between the cabin and the forest, unsure where danger might come from. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely moving, listening to every sound. When dawn finally came, I cautiously peered outside. The footprints were gone, and the forest looked calm. The fear lingered, though. I decided I couldn't stay much longer. I packed essentials, checked the SUV, and prepared to leave. As I drove down the dirt road, I felt my pulse slow with each passing mile. I glanced back at the forest, and the cabin shrinking behind me. The isolation, the uncertainty, the fear, it all began to fade, replaced by relief. By the time I reached the nearest town, I felt almost normal again. I reported the incident to the local ranger station, explaining the unusual signs, the tracks, and the noises. They noted that the area was known for bears and occasional poachers, but reassured me that such encounters were rare. Weeks later, I returned home. The experience stayed with me, etched into my memory. I realized that fear is not always irrational. Sometimes it is a warning, a signal that we must respect the environment and the unknown. The cabin trip had been beautiful, but the terror had been real, grounding, and unforgettable. I learned to prepare better, to respect the wilderness, and to trust my instincts. The forest had tested me, and I had survived, not by courage alone, but by caution, awareness, and the simple human instinct to survive. Even now, whenever I close my eyes, I can see the still lake, the towering pines, and the shadows that moved just beyond sight. I remember the scraping of the footsteps, the weight of the silence, and the primal dread that comes with being utterly alone. But I also remember leaving, stepping back into safety, and feeling the sun on my face, knowing I had endured it and come out intact. The memory is terrifying, yes, but also strangely empowering. A reminder that life in the wilderness is not a fairy tale, not an adventure story, but a test of patience, observation, and respect. On the sixth night, I woke to a sound that froze me completely. Someone was trying the door. Not knocking, not an accident, pulling and testing the lock with deliberate force. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The door rattled, and then the cabin's wooden frame creaked under the pressure. Whoever it was tried to open the windows next, one by one, checking if they were secure. I realized then that I was facing a person who knew what they were doing, someone who could have planned this. I felt my body go cold. I stayed crouched behind the stove for what felt like hours. The intruder finally left before dawn, their retreating footsteps slow and measured, leaving me trembling and soaked in sweat. I knew I couldn't stay another night. Leaving during daylight might be safer, but I had to plan carefully. I packed the essentials in my backpack: water, food, my knife, a flashlight, and the keys. I decided to leave at first light, knowing the forest was less predictable in darkness, but fearing the intruder might be waiting for nightfall. Morning came gray and cold. I moved cautiously, checking the path before stepping onto it. The forest seemed quiet, but I kept my ears alert for any sound. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to shift unnaturally. The cabin behind me felt oppressive, almost alive with the threat I had sensed these past days. I walked quickly yet carefully, following the faint tire tracks back toward the main road. Halfway down the trail, I heard it, a distant shout, muffled but clearly human. My pace quickened. The forest seemed endless, but finally, after what felt like hours, though it was only 30 minutes, I reached the road. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my car, locked doors, engine running, and heart racing. The road down the mountain felt like a relief, though I didn't dare glance back at the trees. When I finally reached the first small town, I stopped at a gas station, shaking, exhausted, and called the local sheriff. I reported the cabin, the footprints, the intrusion, and everything I had experienced. The officer took notes and promised to send someone, but I knew they would arrive long after the intruder had vanished. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin had been targeted before. The previous owner had left suddenly, citing unexplained disturbances and evidence that someone had been entering the property. The isolation of the cabin, the difficulty of accessing it, and the dense forest made it an easy target for someone wanting to hide in the woods. I realized then that the fear I had felt was not imagined. It was grounded in a very real danger. In the end, I never returned to the cabin. I sold it to a local who promised to renovate it and put security measures in place, and I moved further away from the mountains. But the memory of those nights never left me. The heavy footsteps, the feeling of being watched, the way the forest could be both beautiful and terrifying. I had gone there seeking solitude, only to find that isolation can be far more dangerous than any ghost or myth. Real danger comes in the form of people, and in the forest, you never know who might be watching, waiting, or planning to take advantage of your loneliness. Even now, years later, I remember the smell of the damp wood, the cold, the quiet that presses against your ears and your chest, and the way the trees seemed to close in, hiding threats that were all too real. That experience changed me. I learned to respect the wilderness not just for its beauty, but for its ability to hide the presence of someone who could harm you. And I learned that fear is not always a story. Sometimes it is survival, sharpened by the knowledge that the world is bigger and more dangerous than you realize. And that sometimes, the scariest thing is being alone with someone who shouldn't be there. It started with a sense of escape. I had been planning this trip for months, telling myself I needed to get away from the city, away from the noise, the constant buzz of people, traffic, and screens. The idea of a small, isolated cabin in the woods felt like freedom, like a chance to breathe again. I had found the cabin online, a tiny wooden structure tucked into a remote part of the forest, far from any road that could be easily traveled. The pictures looked perfect. A small porch overlooking a creek, a little fire pit outside, and a view of dense forest that seemed untouched. I didn't know it yet, but the images had hidden the truth, the part that would make me rethink every step I took once I was actually there. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had been long, winding through narrow roads that sometimes turned into dirt paths, the kind where a single wrong turn could easily strand you. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, just dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows that made the forest look darker than it was. The cabin sat in a clearing, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I climbed up, my backpack heavy with supplies. The air smelled of damp leaves, pine, and earth, and I breathed it in, feeling my chest relax in a way it hadn't in months. The cabin itself was small, maybe 20 by 20 feet. The interior was simple. A wooden floor that creaked under every step, a small kitchen with a tiny sink, a stove, and a refrigerator that had seen better days. There was a single bedroom in the back with a double bed, and a small bathroom with a shower. I set my bag down, unpacked a few things, and walked over to the window that faced the forest. The trees seemed endless, thick and dark, moving slightly in the breeze. The creek nearby made a soft, constant gurgling sound that was almost hypnotic. I told myself it would be peaceful here, that I had done the right thing coming out of the city. I started a small fire in the cabin's wood stove. The logs were dry, stacked in a corner, and with a little effort, I got the flames going. The warmth felt good against the chill that was already settling into the forest as the sun disappeared. I had brought some food with me, canned soup, bread, and a few vegetables, and I prepared a simple meal while the fire crackled. The cabin smelled of burning wood and pine smoke, a smell that was oddly comforting, almost familiar. I ate slowly, savoring the silence around me. There were no planes overhead, no distant cars, nothing but the wind moving through the trees and the occasional sound of birds settling down for the night. After eating, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The clearing was small, but the forest beyond seemed dense, almost suffocating. I followed a narrow path that led down to the creek, careful not to slip on the damp leaves. The water ran clear and cold, moving over rocks and fallen branches. I knelt and splashed some water on my face, feeling the chill wake me up. I walked along the creek for a while, listening to the forest. It was quiet in a way that was almost unnatural, the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every sound. The rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush, the snap of a twig underfoot, the distant cry of a bird, all of it seemed amplified. I knew then that I was truly alone here, and it was a different kind of feeling from anything I had experienced in the city. When I returned to the cabin, night had fallen completely. I lit a few lanterns I had brought and sat by the fire, watching the flames. The cabin felt smaller now, and the darkness outside seemed thicker, almost pressing against the windows. I told myself it was just the isolation, that being alone in a place like this would always feel strange at first. I went to bed early, leaving the fire burning low so I could wake if I needed warmth. The first night was mostly quiet, though I woke a few times to strange sounds. Branches scratching against the cabin, the wind shifting through the trees, but I chalked it up to the forest settling around me. The next morning, I woke to fog. Thick, white fog had rolled into the clearing overnight, blanketing the trees and the creek. The world outside looked surreal, almost like I was in a dream. I dressed quickly and went outside to get a closer look. The fog made everything eerily silent, and even the creek seemed quieter than before. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, and the trees seemed like looming shapes just out of reach. I decided to take a walk, staying close to the cabin, following the faint path I had discovered the day before. The damp air clung to my clothes, and the ground was slippery underfoot. I moved carefully, aware that one wrong step could send me tumbling down the muddy slope that ran alongside the creek. As I walked, I started noticing signs of the forest's other inhabitants. Fresh tracks in the mud, deep and heavy, indicated deer or maybe elk had passed through recently. I saw claw marks on a tree trunk that looked too deep to be anything small. My heart rate quickened, not in fear of an immediate threat, but out of awareness that I was not alone. The forest, despite its beauty, had a presence that I couldn't ignore. I returned to the cabin, brushing off mud from my boots and noticing a sense of unease settling in my chest. The fog was thick now, rolling through the clearing and making the cabin appear like an isolated island. I lit the fire again and tried to push the thoughts away, focusing instead on preparing breakfast. It was later in the day, mid-morning, when the first real sign of danger appeared. I had stepped outside to gather firewood, walking down the path that led into the forest to find dry branches. The fog had lifted slightly, but the forest still seemed dark and foreboding. That's when I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes in the distance, reflecting the light of the sun that had just broken through the trees. I froze, heart pounding, watching as a large animal stepped into view. It was a black bear, standing on all fours, sniffing the air. My mind raced. I had read about black bears before. They could be dangerous, especially if surprised or hungry. I slowly backed away, making myself look bigger by raising my arms, and the bear watched me for a long moment before turning and disappearing into the forest. I realized then that this cabin, this forest, was not just peaceful isolation. It was wild, and I was a visitor in a place where the rules of the city didn't apply. Over the next few days, I became increasingly aware of the vulnerability that came with being alone in such a place. The bear had passed through again at night, leaving scratches on the cabin door and deep tracks in the soft soil nearby. I reinforced the cabin as best I could, stacking logs against the doors and checking the windows for any gaps. I kept a heavy stick and a hatchet near my bed, knowing that I needed to be ready if something came too close. Every sound in the night made me jump, from the hoot of an owl to the creak of the floorboards under the cabin settling. I stopped wandering far from the cabin, learning to stay close to safety. Then came the storm. The forecast had mentioned rain, but it arrived with far more intensity than I had expected. By late afternoon, dark clouds had rolled in, and the wind picked up, rattling the trees and sending branches crashing to the ground. I could hear the creek swelling, water running faster, threatening to overflow the banks. I stayed inside, lighting the fire and sitting near the window, watching as the rain hammered against the roof and the wind moaned through the trees. At one point, a large branch broke off from a tree near the cabin, hitting the roof with a loud crash that shook the walls. I checked carefully to make sure the cabin was still intact, heart pounding. I realized then how exposed I was, how fragile the safety of this little wooden structure could be in the face of nature's force. That night, the noises outside were worse. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned under its force. I could hear something moving in the underbrush near the cabin. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, but the sounds were irregular, deliberate. Something was circling the cabin. I gripped a heavy kitchen knife and moved quietly to the window, peeking through the glass. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift unnaturally. I could see shapes moving, but only briefly, always disappearing before I could get a full look. My heart raced. I considered leaving the cabin immediately, but it was dark, and the trail back to the road was narrow and treacherous. I didn't want to risk injury or getting lost. Hours passed slowly. I stayed near the stove, keeping the fire alive and checking the windows and doors repeatedly. I convinced myself several times that it was just a wild animal, maybe a bear or a large dog, attracted by the smell of my food. But the sounds didn't stop, and every time I heard a snap of a branch or the shuffle of leaves, I tensed, ready to defend myself. I didn't sleep, I just sat there, listening to the forest, waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted and tense, but alive. The sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the forest with pale light. I cautiously went outside to check the perimeter. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I found small signs that something large had been moving around the cabin during the night. Broken branches, footprints too large for a dog, and flattened grass near the windows. My fear shifted from abstract unease to real danger. There was someone or something near my cabin. I spent the next day preparing for the possibility of an intruder. I reinforced the doors as best I could, placing heavy furniture against them and setting up makeshift alarms by tying cans to strings along the perimeter. I also moved my supplies into the loft, out of reach. I stayed near the windows and kept a close watch on the forest, never letting myself be alone for more than a few minutes at a time. Every sound made me flinch, every shadow made me tense. I started to notice patterns. At certain times of day, the underbrush would rustle, as if the intruder was watching me. I realized that this was no random animal. By the third night, I was on edge, barely sleeping and constantly alert. I had a plan to leave at first light if anything happened. Around midnight, I heard it again. A movement, slow and careful, just beyond the treeline. I grabbed the largest piece of firewood I could find and moved toward the front door. My hands were shaking, my heart hammering. I could see a figure crouched among the trees, just barely visible in the weak light of the cabin. It wasn't moving much, just observing. I stayed still, holding my breath, and waited. Hours passed like this. Eventually, the figure disappeared, moving silently back into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I packed everything hastily, not wanting to leave anything behind. I checked the trail to the road, careful to mark my way so I wouldn't get lost. The drive back was tense. Every sound from the trees, every shadow in the morning light, made me jump. When I finally reached the town, the relief was immense. I reported the incident to the local authorities, providing the details and my photographs of the cabin and the surrounding forest. They told me that others had experienced similar situations in that area. People renting cabins had noticed signs of someone watching them, sometimes leaving items disturbed, sometimes attempting break-ins. The forest provided perfect cover, and the isolation made it dangerous. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. I had prepared carefully, stayed aware, and trusted my instincts. I never saw the person again, but the fear and tension of those nights stayed with me for a long time. The cabin itself was peaceful and beautiful in daylight, but at night, it became a trap if you weren't careful. I learned that even in the most serene settings, humans can be the scariest creatures of all. That experience changed how I approach solitude. I still loved nature, still sought quiet, but I never again ignored the realities of isolation. I now carry tools, I scout locations carefully, and I always leave word with someone about where I am going. The fear I felt in that cabin never left entirely, but it became a lesson in preparation, awareness, and respect for the unknown presence of others. Months later, I returned to the city, still shaken, still processing the events. I often think about the cabin, about the quiet nights and the sounds of movement just outside the door. I sometimes imagine what would have happened if I had been careless, if I hadn't fortified the cabin or stayed alert. The thought is chilling, but I also feel a strange gratitude. That experience taught me more about myself than I could have imagined. The limits of endurance, the importance of vigilance, and the value of preparation. The forest is beautiful, but it is also indifferent. People may wander into it, but they are never truly alone. I carry that lesson with me every time I go anywhere remote now, and it has changed the way I live, the way I move, and the way I understand danger. The cabin itself was never the same after my visit. I never returned, and I avoided all listings in that area. The images haunt me sometimes. The smell of wood smoke and wet earth, the sound of branches cracking under invisible footsteps. I still write about my experiences, not to scare people, but to make them aware. Nature is magnificent, but isolation is dangerous, and other people, unseen and unknown, can turn a serene retreat into something terrifying. The memory of those nights is sharp and vivid, a reminder that the human mind is constantly scanning for threats, and that instinct, preparation, and caution are not luxuries. They are essential. Looking back, I understand how easily things could have gone wrong. That cabin was a trap waiting to be sprung, and I had walked right into it. I am grateful for my luck, for the knowledge that carried me through, and for the warning it gave me. I learned that no matter how careful you are, the wilderness is unpredictable, and the most frightening thing is not a ghost or a monster, but a human presence where you expect none. In the end, I survived because I respected that reality, because I remained vigilant, and because I treated the forest not as a playground, but as a place that demands attention, preparation, and respect. I never took isolation lightly again. I had always thought of the cabin as a place to escape. It was small, old, and tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by dense pines and the kind of silence that could feel heavy at first, but somehow freeing if you let yourself settle into it. The thought of being entirely alone, away from the city noise, the cars, the hum of electricity and fluorescent lights, had drawn me here. I wanted solitude, but what I hadn't anticipated was how unprepared I was for the weight of absolute isolation. The drive to the cabin had taken longer than I expected. The map said 2.5 hours, but the winding mountain roads, narrow and unkempt, slowed my progress. I remembered gripping the steering wheel tightly as the asphalt cracked and twisted beneath my tires, thinking that any wrong turn could leave me stranded miles from the nearest town. The forest had grown thicker as I ascended, the trees bending over the road like they were trying to block my path. By the time I reached the small dirt path leading to the cabin, the sun was already low, casting long, jagged shadows across the road. The cabin itself appeared suddenly through the trees, almost hidden. Its wooden exterior was weathered, gray from years of sun and rain, with a metal roof that had started to rust. I parked the car and got out, stretching my legs. The air was cold and smelled faintly of damp wood and pine needles. I had brought a small backpack with essentials: food, water, a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and some firewood. No one else would be here for miles. The nearest neighbor, I had been told, was more than 2 miles down a rough, uneven trail. I stepped onto the small porch, noticing the slight creak of the wood beneath my boots, a sound so loud in the still air it startled me. Inside, the cabin was rustic. Dust coated the corners, and spider webs hung from the ceiling, but it felt livable. A small wood stove sat in one corner, with enough firewood stacked neatly beside it to last a week if used sparingly. The windows were small and dirty, but they offered a view of the surrounding forest. I unpacked my things, arranging them neatly. As night began to fall, I built a small fire in the stove. The sound of the wood crackling was comforting, almost hypnotic. Shadows flickered on the walls, making the small space feel alive in a strange way. The first night passed without incident, though I remember lying awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest. Branches scraped against each other, small animals rustled in the underbrush, and an occasional distant howl of a coyote reminded me that I was not entirely alone. Even though I had come here seeking isolation, the wilderness had a presence of its own, indifferent and persistent. The second day was uneventful. I explored the area around the cabin, marking a small trail in case I needed to leave quickly. The forest was dense, thick with undergrowth and uneven terrain. Fallen logs and exposed roots made walking tricky, and I found myself constantly scanning for snakes or other creatures. I collected more firewood, stacking it near the cabin door, and gathered water from a small stream I had found nearby. The air was colder than I expected, especially once the sun went behind the mountains. I spent the evening reading an old book I had brought, the cabin feeling warm and safe as the fire burned. It was on the third day that I first noticed something odd. I had gone down to the stream early in the morning, just after sunrise, to fill my water bottles. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. As I bent to fill my bottles, I noticed footprints in the mud. Human footprints, clearly from a booted person, leading away from the stream and into the denser part of the forest. My heart raced. I knew no one else should be here. The nearest hiker would be miles away on a marked trail, not wandering near my isolated cabin. The footprints were fresh. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I decided to follow them, just enough to see where they led, keeping the cabin in sight. The prints disappeared after about 50 feet, as though whoever had left them had simply vanished into the forest. I returned to the cabin quickly, locking the door and checking all the windows. Nothing seemed disturbed inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I heard noises I hadn't heard before. Not the usual rustling of small animals or the distant coyote calls, but footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps outside the cabin. They circled the building slowly, pausing every so often, as if the person was listening or checking for something. I stayed very still, gripping a kitchen knife I had found in a drawer, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sounds continued for nearly an hour, and then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. The forest returned to its usual quiet. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too tense to sleep, watching shadows move through the window. The next morning, I debated whether to leave immediately. I knew I could drive back down the mountain, but the thought of leaving my car and belongings unattended felt unsafe. I decided to stay, convincing myself that it might have been someone passing by, though my instincts screamed otherwise. I reinforced the doors as best as I could, blocking them with furniture and tying the windows shut with rope I found in the cabin. Every noise made me jump, and even small animals seemed threatening. The tension was exhausting. Over the next few days, the presence became more unsettling. Objects inside the cabin were moved slightly when I wasn't looking. My backpack shifted on the bed. A log from the wood pile lay out of place. Footprints appeared near the cabin in the dirt and snow, too large to be mine, sometimes going in and out of the woods as though someone had been circling the cabin. I stayed inside as much as possible, carrying the knife and flashlight wherever I went. Food became scarce and I started rationing water. My anxiety grew with each passing night, the quiet weight of the forest pressing in. I realized then that I wasn't alone the night before. Someone, or multiple people, had been moving around my cabin while I slept. Panic surged through me, but I stayed calm on the outside, walking slowly back to the cabin and checking everything again. Windows, doors, locks, the woodpile. Everything was where I left it, but the tracks were a warning. I couldn't see anyone, and there was no sign of them now, but I knew they had been close. I debated what to do. Drive to the nearest town? Call the police? The problem was that cell reception was weak, barely enough to send a text, let alone a call. I decided the safest option was to leave, to pack up and get back to the road as quickly as possible. I grabbed my supplies, loaded the car, and checked the cabin one last time. Everything was still quiet. The tracks ended at the edge of the trees, and there was no sign of anyone around. I drove off, carefully scanning the road and the forest for movement. I reached the main road about an hour later. The tension from the previous night had me shaking, but I felt a sense of relief seeing other cars, other people, civilization. I stopped at a small diner to calm down, eat, and gather my thoughts. While I was there, I noticed a news bulletin on the screen behind the counter. A small group of hikers had been caught breaking into cabins in the mountains, stealing supplies, and occasionally confronting those who stayed there. I realized that I had been lucky. They hadn't intended to harm anyone, at least not directly, but they had been prowling while I slept. The dragging noise, the tracks, they had been trying to move supplies or find a way inside without alerting me. That night, back in the city, I couldn't sleep easily. The images of the forest, the dragging noises, the tracks, they stayed with me, but I also felt a sense of accomplishment, of survival. I had stayed alert, had trusted my instincts, and had left before the situation escalated. The cabin had seemed like a peaceful getaway, but it had reminded me how vulnerable isolation can make a person, even when the threats are real and not imagined. I eventually returned to the mountains months later, but never to the same cabin. Instead, I found another cabin, closer to the main road with better security. I was older, more cautious, and more aware of what it meant to be alone in the wilderness. That experience stayed with me. I learned the importance of preparation, observation, and respect for the reality of isolation. I also learned to trust my instincts. If something feels off, it usually is. And sometimes, the most terrifying experiences aren't supernatural. They're just the quiet, deliberate presence of other humans in a place where you thought you were completely alone. I never saw the people who had been near my cabin, and I never knew exactly what they had been doing. But I did know that my caution had saved me. I kept a journal of the event, recording every detail, the sound, the tracks, the feeling of complete vulnerability in that small cabin. Months later, I revisited the journal and could still feel the fear and tension. And yet, I also felt a strange sense of pride. I had faced a real danger in a place that seemed safe, and I had come out of it unharmed. That clarity, that hard-earned understanding of danger and caution, was something that no amount of preparation or imagination could ever give me before that trip. From that trip onward, whenever I thought about the mountains, I remembered the quiet, the fire, the tracks, and the dragging sound in the night. It was terrifying, yes, but it was real, and it changed me. And in the end, it had a clear conclusion. I had survived, I had learned, and I had respected the wild, not as a ghost story, not as a fairy tale, but as a real, living place where people and dangers exist, sometimes silently, sometimes deliberately, and always beyond your control. I had been planning this trip for months, the kind of trip that meant escaping the city completely and spending a few days in the wilderness, completely alone. I needed it. My work had been unbearable, deadlines crushing me, my apartment stifling. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, miles from the main road. It was an old log cabin, built decades ago, with a small creek running nearby and thick pine trees surrounding it. The pictures online were perfect. Rustic but cozy, a wood stove for heat, a small kitchen, a lofted bedroom, and a porch that looked out onto the trees. I booked it and told myself that nothing could go wrong. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through narrow roads covered in fallen leaves. It was late afternoon when I finally arrived. The air was cool, a sharp change from the humid city, and the smell of pine hit me immediately. The cabin was exactly like the pictures, small, with weathered logs and a slightly creaking porch. I parked my car nearby, carrying my bags, and immediately felt the weight of solitude. There were no neighbors in sight, no cars passing by, no distant lights, just the cabin and the forest. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and was greeted by the faint smell of old wood and dust. Felt safe in a strange way, but also lonely. I spent the first hour unpacking and checking the cabin. The stove worked, the bed was made, and the windows were intact. There was a small woodpile stacked neatly by the door. Outside, the forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I had expected birds or insects, but for some reason, the silence was heavier than I imagined. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. As night began to fall, I decided to build a fire in the stove. The firelight made the cabin feel warmer and safer. I ate a simple dinner I had packed and then sat by the window, staring at the dark trees. The creek made a soft, constant sound in the distance. At first, it was soothing, but after a while, it started to feel oppressive, like it was emphasizing the isolation. I tried to focus on my book, but my mind kept drifting, noticing small sounds. The wind brushing through the trees, branches snapping somewhere in the distance. Around 11 p.m., I went to bed in the loft. The cabin creaked as I moved around. I slept fitfully, waking occasionally to strange sounds outside. Branches tapping against the windows, something scraping against the side of the cabin. Each time, I convinced myself it was just the forest, deer perhaps, or raccoons. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the trees. I felt a little more at ease. The previous night felt less threatening in the light of day. I spent the next day exploring the area near the cabin. There was a small trail leading deeper into the forest, following the creek. I hiked for a couple of hours, noting how dense the trees were. The air smelled clean, damp, and earthy. I found animal tracks, deer, squirrels, possibly a fox, but nothing dangerous, or so I thought. Returning to the cabin, I felt tired but calm. I started another fire in the stove and settled in for the evening. That night, the sounds outside were louder, sharper. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, something heavy moving through the underbrush. It was different than the night before. There was a pattern now. Something was moving around the cabin. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself it was an animal, probably just a bear or a large deer. Still, I made sure the doors were locked and closed all the windows. I kept a flashlight and my phone by the bed. Around midnight, the scratching started. Not random, not small. Heavy, deliberate scratching against the cabin wall. My stomach sank. I got out of bed slowly, trying to look through the window. The trees were dark, but I could see movement. A large shadow passing between the trunks. My first thought was a bear. I've seen bears before in the wild, but the movement was too precise, too calculated, not like a bear wandering randomly. My instincts screamed at me to stay calm. I tried to ignore it and sat by the fire, my eyes darting to every shadow outside. Then came the sounds at the door. Heavy, deliberate thumping, like something was testing it. My chest tightened. I grabbed the largest knife I had brought, holding it in both hands. Ready. The noise stopped. Silence returned. I forced myself to breathe slowly, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer somehow knocking over debris. But the pit in my stomach didn't go away.